Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history, where millions of women once laboured in silence. Picture this, a cold London morning in 1862. The Thames River stretches before you, and as the fog lifts, you see figures emerging from the mist. Women and children, their clothes tattered and mud-stained, bending down in the filthy water, searching desperately for anything they could sell to survive. These are the women history tried to erase. These are the stories that were deliberately buried, and tonight we're going to uncover every single one of them. Now, before we step into this hidden world together, I'd love it if you could do me a small favor. If this story speaks to you, if you find yourself moved by these forgotten voices, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you tucked in bed in California? Maybe you're listening from London, walking the same streets these women once walked? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I love knowing who's joining me on these midnight journeys. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. The year is 1837. A young woman named Alexandrina Victoria becomes Queen of England at just 18 years old. She will reign for 64 years, and her name will define an entire era, the Victorian Age. When we think of this time, what images come to mind? Grand balls with women in enormous silk gowns, tea parties in manicured gardens, gentlemen in top hats strolling through elegant parks, the British Empire at its absolute peak, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's population. But here's what they don't show you in the history books. Here's what was hidden beneath all that glamour and glory. For every woman sipping tea in a drawing room, there were hundreds, thousands, labouring in conditions so horrific, so dangerous, that their very existence was considered shameful. These women were everywhere, yet somehow they were invisible. They made the matches that lit the wealthy homes. They collected the leeches that doctors used for medicine. They scavenged through the toxic mud of the Thames River, searching for scraps to sell. They wrote the novels we still read today, but they had to use men's names just to be taken seriously. And the most heartbreaking part, their work was systematically erased from official records. Let me explain something fascinating that historians only recently discovered. For decades, scholars believed that Victorian census records massively undercounted women's work. They thought that because society considered it shameful for women to work outside the home, male census takers simply didn't record their occupations. The ideology of the time promoted this concept called separate spheres. Men belonged in the public world of work and politics, while women were supposed to be the angel in the house, focused purely on domestic life and motherhood. But when modern researchers actually went back and examined the original census records in detail, they found something shocking. In just one district of London, Bethnal Green, between 1851 and 1901, there were 178 different job titles recorded for women. 178 in a single neighbourhood. Think about that for a moment. These weren't just the obvious jobs like seamstress or domestic servant. The records showed women working as waterproof makers, sweetmeat makers, farriers, and even valentine makers. There were straw hat makers and paste fitters. There were velvet coat makers and chain makers. In another area called Saffron Hill, researchers found 218 different occupation titles for women. 218 different ways that women were surviving, contributing, labouring. So what happened? Why did we forget? The answer is more complicated than simple sexism, though that certainly played a role. Many of these jobs were irregular, seasonal, or home-based. A woman might work frantically for 3 months making straw bonnets, then have no work for the next 2 months. A mother might finish garments for a factory while simultaneously caring for her children, cooking meals, and maintaining her home. Where does her work begin and her home duties end? The census takers often struggled with this. If a woman told them she helped her husband in his shop while also sewing at night for extra income, what did they write down? Many times, they wrote nothing. They classified her as having no occupation, not because they were necessarily trying to hide her work, but because the very concept of women's labour didn't fit neatly into the boxes and categories that Victorian society had created. There was also the shame factor, which we cannot ignore. In middle-class and upper-class families, a working wife was seen as proof that the husband had failed to provide. Imagine being a Victorian man whose wife had to take in laundry or sew garments to make ends meet. This wasn't just an economic issue. It was a devastating blow to his social standing and masculine identity. So families hid it. They lied about it. They pretended it wasn't happening. But working-class families couldn't afford such pretenses. For them, women's work wasn't optional. It was survival. If a husband got injured at the factory, who would pay the rent? If he fell ill, who would feed the children? There was no workers' compensation in 1860, there were no safety nets, no disability insurance, no welfare system. If you couldn't work, you and your family faced the workhouse, a place so deliberately miserable that people would do almost anything to avoid it. So women worked. Oh, how they worked. According to the 1911 census, near the end of the Victorian era, domestic service alone employed 28% of all working women in England and Wales. That's 1.35 million women serving in other people's homes. But this statistic only counts those who formally identified as domestic servants. It doesn't count the countless women who occasionally took in washing, or who cleaned houses informally, or who helped cook for wealthy families during busy seasons. And domestic service, despite being considered one of the more respectable jobs for working-class women, was grueling. You worked from before dawn until late at night. You slept in tiny rooms, often in the attic or basement. Your wages were low. Room and board were considered part of your payment. And if you were young and pretty, you might face unwanted advances from the men of the household. If you got pregnant, even through no fault of your own, you were immediately dismissed with no references, making it nearly impossible to find other work. But at least domestic servants were visible. At least their work was acknowledged. The women we're going to meet in this series had it worse. Much worse. Some of them worked with substances so toxic that their bones literally rotted away while they were still alive. Some of them waded through sewage and toxic mud, risking drowning and disease with every shift. Some of them were so desperate that they used their own bodies as bait to collect medical supplies. And some of them changed the world with their words, but had to pretend to be men just to be heard. These women existed in every corner of Victorian England, in the industrial cities of the north, where factory smoke blackened the sky, in the elegant streets of London, where they were carefully kept out of sight of polite society, in rural villages, where they worked in cottage industries that exploited their labour for pennies. They were everywhere and nowhere, essential and invisible. And the truly remarkable thing, despite everything, despite the poverty, the danger, the complete lack of legal protections, the social stigma, these women persevered. They organised. They fought back. The match girls who were slowly being poisoned by phosphorus went on strike and won concessions from their powerful employers. The women writers who had to use male pseudonyms produced some of the greatest literature in the English language. The mothers who scavenged in the Thames mud managed to keep their children alive another day. Their resilience was extraordinary. Their courage was undeniable, and their stories deserved to be told. Over the next hours, we're going to walk in their footsteps. We're going to understand not just what they did, but why they did it, and what it cost them. We're going to meet real women with real names, real fears, and real dreams. We're going to see Victorian England not from the perspective of queens and ladies and drawing rooms, but from the perspective of women whose hands were stained with phosphorus, whose feet were scarred from broken glass, whose names appeared in census records under occupations you've never heard of. Some of these stories will shock you. Some will break your heart. Some might even make you angry at how little protection these women had, how their suffering was ignored, how their contributions were erased. But I hope, more than anything, these stories will inspire you, because every right that women have today, the right to vote, to own property, to work in any profession, to be paid fairly, to be protected by labour laws, was built on the backs of women like these, women who refused to be invisible, even when history tried to make them disappear. So let's begin where so many Victorian stories begin, in the factories. But not the grand industrial mills of the textile trade. No, we're going somewhere smaller, more confined, more deadly. We're going to a place where teenage girls work 12 to 18 hours a day with a substance that would eventually eat away their faces. We're going to meet the match girls, young women who quite literally danced with death for pennies. And when we arrive there, in that hot, phosphorus-filled room, you'll understand why their story isn't just history. It's a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. The factory floor is sweltering. It's July in London, 1888, and inside the Bryant and May match factory in Bow, East London, the temperature hovers somewhere around 90 degrees. But it's not the heat that hits you first when you walk through those doors. It's the smell, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. White phosphorus, the chemical that makes matches light with just a single strike. The chemical that's slowly killing everyone in this room. Look around. Do you see them? Girls mostly, some as young as 12 years old. Their fingers move with practiced speed, dipping wooden sticks into vats of heated phosphorus paste, laying them out to dry, packing them into boxes. Dip, lay, pack. Dip, lay, pack. Hour after hour after hour. 14 hours today, maybe 16 tomorrow. Some days when there's a big order, they won't leave until they've worked 20 hours straight. And here's the thing that makes your stomach turn. They're eating lunch at their workstations, right there, surrounded by phosphorus fumes, because they're not allowed to leave, not even for meals. So they unwrap their bread, the only food many of them can afford, and they eat it with contaminated hands, in contaminated air, breathing in poison with every bite. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Sarah Chapman. She's 23 years old in 1888, which means she's been working here since she was about 13. A full decade of breathing phosphorus. Sarah is one of the lucky ones, though she doesn't know it yet. Her jawbone is still intact. Some of her co-workers aren't so fortunate. You want to know what phossy jaw looks like? I'll tell you, but I'll be gentle about it, because this is difficult to hear. It starts innocently enough. A toothache. Just a little pain in your jaw. You think maybe you need to see a dentist, but dentists cost money you don't have, so you ignore it. Then the pain gets worse. Your gum starts to swell, an abscess forms. And then, if you're truly unlucky, the bone itself begins to rot. The medical term is phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. What it means is that the phosphorus you've been breathing day after day, month after month, has accumulated in your bones. And now those bones are dying while you're still alive. Your jaw literally disintegrates. Pieces of bone have to be surgically removed. Your face becomes disfigured. And the smell. Oh, The smell. Your breath reeks of rotting flesh because that's exactly what's happening inside your mouth. Approximately 1 in 10 match workers develop this condition. Think about that statistic for a moment. 1 in 10. Those aren't good odds when your alternative is starvation. But the physical horror of phossy jaw isn't even the worst part. The worst part is how the factory owners treated these girls. If you sat down, you were fined. If you went to the bathroom without permission, you were fined. If you talked to your neighbor, you were fined. If you dropped a single match, you were fined. And these weren't small fines. We're talking about penalties that could eat up half a day's wages. Wages that, by the way, range from 4 shillings to 8 shillings per week. To put that in perspective, you needed about 12 shillings a week just to cover basic rent and food for a small family. The factory employed about 2,000 women and girls at its peak. 2,000 human beings working in these conditions. And Bryant and May, the company, was phenomenally profitable. The owners lived in mansions. They donated to charities. They were respected members of society. Meanwhile, the girls making their fortune were literally losing their faces. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't they just quit? Why didn't they find other work? And that's a fair question if you've never been truly desperate. But here's the reality these girls faced. Most of them were the primary breadwinners for their families. Their fathers might be dead, disabled, or drunk. Their mothers might be trying to feed 6 or 7 younger children on nothing but bread and tea. There were no other jobs available, at least none that paid any better. Domestic service meant living away from your family and being at the mercy of your employer's whims. Factory work in textiles wasn't much better and often paid less. Prostitution was always lurking as the absolute last resort, and many former match girls ended up there when they became too ill to work, so they stayed. They dipped those wooden sticks in poison, they packed those boxes, they brought home their shillings, and they hoped they'd be one of the lucky 9 out of 10 who didn't develop phossy jaw. But then something remarkable happened. In June of 1888, a woman named Annie Besant visited the factory. Annie was a social reformer, a fierce advocate for workers' rights, and the editor of a radical newspaper called The Link. Some of the match girls spoke to her, probably terrified they'd be caught and fired, but desperate enough to risk it. They told her everything: the 14-hour days, the fines for breathing wrong, the phosphorus poisoning, the starvation wages, and on June 23, 1888, Annie Besant published an article with a title that would shock Victorian England: White Slavery in London. White slavery. Those words carried enormous weight in 1888, deliberately invoking the horrors of actual slavery to describe the conditions of these British workers. The article was explosive. It laid out every abuse in detail. The public was outraged. How could this be happening in civilized England? How could British girls be treated worse than machinery? Bryant and May's response was predictable. They fired 3 workers who'd spoken to Annie Besant. And that's when everything changed. On a July morning, one of those cold July days that only London seems to manage, 200 match girls walked out. Just walked out. Left their stations. Refused to work. These were girls who'd been told their entire lives that they were worthless, that they were lucky to have jobs at all, that they should be grateful for the opportunity to slowly poison themselves for 4 shillings a week, and they said no. Within days, 200 had become 2,000. The entire factory was on strike. Can you imagine what that took? These girls had no union backing them. Women's unions barely existed. They had no strike fund to fall back on. Every day they weren't working was a day their families weren't eating, but they stood together anyway. They marched to Parliament, actual Parliament, with Annie Besant leading them. 2,000 match girls, many of them teenagers, demanding to be treated like human beings. The newspapers covered it extensively. The public rallied behind them. Donations poured in to help feed the striking workers and their families. The girls became celebrities of a sort, representatives of all the invisible, exploited workers across England. Sarah Chapman, the young woman I mentioned earlier, became one of the leaders. She spoke at rallies. She negotiated with factory management. This young woman who'd started dipping matches at 13 years old was now standing up to one of the most powerful companies in London. And here's the beautiful part. They won. Not everything they wanted. That would have been too much to hope for. But within 2 weeks, Bryant and May agreed to end the worst fines, improve conditions, and recognize the workers' right to organize. It wasn't perfect. The girls still worked with white phosphorus. That wouldn't be banned for years. But it was something. It was proof that even the most powerless workers could force change if they stood together. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 became a watershed moment in British labour history. It helped spark the formation of women's trade unions. It showed that so-called unskilled workers could organise effectively. It brought attention to dangerous working conditions across all industries. Those brave girls didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for every exploited worker in England. Sarah Chapman, our match girl, went on to become a prominent union organiser. She lived until 1945, 57 years after the strike, and she spent many of those years fighting for workers' rights. The girl who started with poisoned hands ended up changing the world a little bit. But let's not romanticize this too much. The victory was real but limited. Many match girls continued to develop phossy jaw. Many more were worked to exhaustion for wages that barely kept them alive. The strike improved conditions at Bryant and May, but thousands of other factories continued to exploit women and children with impunity. And here's something that might surprise you. Even after all the publicity, even after the strike, the British government didn't ban white phosphorus in match manufacturing. You know when it finally disappeared? The 1960s. Not because it was outlawed, but because men's hat fashion changed and there was less demand for matches. Seriously. The thing that finally ended phosphorus poisoning wasn't regulation or moral outrage. It was shifting fashion trends and the invention of safer, lighter technology. That's the reality these women lived in. Change came slowly, if at all. Protection was minimal. Your life was worth whatever the factory owners decided it was worth. But, and this is important, those match girls proved something crucial. They proved that solidarity works. They proved that even the most vulnerable workers have power when they organize. They proved that the public, when properly informed, will support justice over profit. Those lessons echo through labor movements even today. So the next time you strike a match, and I know most of us use lighters now, but stick with me here, remember those girls. Remember Sarah Chapman and the 2,000 others who said enough. Remember that the simple ability to light a candle safely, without risking your jawbone, came at an enormous cost paid by women whose names most of us will never know. The match girls showed us what courage looks like, but they weren't the only Victorian women working in unimaginable conditions, not by a long shot. Because while some women were poisoning themselves in factories, others were quite literally wading through the filth and sewage of the Thames River, competing with the tides themselves for survival. The mudlarks, children and women who made their living in the toxic mud of London's river. And their story is waiting for us in the cold water and the morning mist. Dawn breaks over the Thames and the water is retreating. It's 1861, and if you stand on one of London's bridges at low tide, you'll witness a sight that visitors to the city found both fascinating and deeply disturbing. As the river pulls back, revealing its muddy banks, figures begin to appear. Small figures mostly. Children. Some as young as 6 years old. They emerge from the alleyways and slums near the riverbank, and they descend into the mud like ghosts materializing from the fog. These are the mudlarks, and their office, if you can call it that, is one of the most dangerous workplaces in all of Victorian England. Let me take you down there with them. Feel that? The mud is cold, even in summer. It's not the pleasant, smooth mud you might play with as a child. This is Thames mud. Thick, foul-smelling, mixed with everything London throws into its river. Raw sewage, industrial chemicals, offal from the slaughterhouses, the rotting remains of whatever couldn't be used or sold. This is where these children spend their mornings, bent over, their hands plunging again and again into the filth, searching for anything at all, that might be worth a penny or two. There's a man I want you to meet, though he's been dead for over a century and a half. His name was Henry Mayhew, and in 1851 he published a book called London Labour and the London Poor. Mayhew was a journalist, but he was also something rarer in Victorian England, someone who actually listened to poor people. He went down to the Thames, he interviewed the mudlarks, he recorded their stories in their own words, and what he found breaks your heart even now. Mayhew describes meeting a 9-year-old boy who was working the riverbank near Millwall. Let me paint you the picture he witnessed. The boy's trousers were worn away up to his knees, not fashionably torn but genuinely disintegrated from constant exposure to the corrosive mud. He had no shirt. None. His legs and feet were bare and they were covered with chilblains. Do you know what chilblains are? They're painful inflammation and blisters caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp. Imagine having them all over your feet and legs, and then having to walk through freezing mud every single morning. This boy told Mayhew he'd been mudlarking for 3 years. 3 years, which means he started when he was 6 years old. And here's the part that haunts me. When Mayhew asked about his future, the boy said he supposed he'd remain a mudlark all his life. What else could he be? There was nothing else he knew how to do. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, and he didn't think he could learn even if he tried. Every penny he found in the mud, every single penny, he gave to his mother, and she bought bread with it. Just bread. That was their existence. Mud, pennies, bread. Day after day after day. The boy told Mayhew he worked with about 20 to 30 other children. Every morning at daybreak you could see them along the Thames with their trousers tucked up, groping about in the mud, picking out pieces of coal that had fallen from the coal barges. They'd collect these fragments in little pots and sell them to local poor people for a penny per pot. Sometimes they'd find pieces of iron worth a penny, maybe 3 pence if they were very lucky. But here's what really tells you about the desperation of this work. The boy told Mayhew that he went into the river up to his knees, and sometimes the mud had pieces of glass or broken pottery hidden in it. He'd cut his feet constantly. When this happened, when he was bleeding and limping, he'd go home and dress the wounds as best he could with whatever rags were available, and then, almost immediately, he'd return to the riverside. Because if the tide came up without him having found something, he would starve until the next low tide. Let that sink in for a moment. A 9-year-old child, feet bleeding, choosing between pain and starvation. That's not a choice. That's survival at its most brutal. The mudlarks had to be experts in the tides. The Thames is a tidal river, which means twice a day the water rises and falls dramatically. At low tide you might have a few hours, maybe 4 or 5 if you're lucky, to scavenge before the water returns, and when that tide comes in, it comes fast. Children died being swept away, unable to climb the slippery banks quickly enough. Others got stuck in particularly soft mud, the kind that holds your feet like cement, and drowned as the water rose around them. And it wasn't just the physical dangers. The Thames police patrolled the river, and their job was to stop people from taking anything that might technically belong to the ships or the port. If a mudlark found a piece of rope or an iron nail that had fallen from a vessel, was that theft or salvage? The law was unclear, but the police didn't care. They chased the mudlarks away, sometimes violently. So these children had to be quick, constantly looking over their shoulders, ready to run at any moment. Mayhew estimated that mudlarks collectively earned about £6,000 a year in the mid-1800s. That sounds like a lot until you divide it among the hundreds, possibly thousands, of mudlarks working the Thames. Most individuals were making just enough to buy bread and perhaps a bit of tea. Meat was a luxury they almost never experienced. Shoes were out of the question. You're probably wondering about their families. Where were their parents? Why weren't they protecting these children? And here's the painful answer. In most cases, their parents were dead, disabled, or just as desperate. A mudlark family might consist of a widowed mother with 4 or 5 children, all of whom had to work to keep the family from the workhouse. Or it might be an elderly grandmother trying to raise orphaned grandchildren. Or it might be a father who'd been injured in a factory accident and could no longer work, sending his children out to earn while he minded the younger babies at home. There were also adult mudlarks, particularly women. Mayhew interviewed several, and he described them with unusual sympathy for a Victorian gentleman. These were women who'd fallen through every possible social safety net. Maybe they were widows with no family to help them. Maybe they'd been domestic servants who got pregnant and were dismissed. Maybe they'd tried factory work and couldn't keep up with the brutal pace. The Thames became their last resort. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of mudlarking was how it trapped people across generations. Remember that 9-year-old boy? He'll probably have children someday if he survives to adulthood. And what will those children do? The same thing he did. Because he'll have nothing to teach them except how to read the tides and find coal in the mud. Poverty wasn't just a condition in Victorian England, it was an inheritance, passed from parent to child like a genetic disease. But let me tell you something that might surprise you. Within this brutal existence there was a kind of community. The mudlarks knew each other. They helped each other spot valuable items. They warned each other when the police were coming. The older mudlarks taught the younger ones which areas were safest, which tides were most dangerous, which merchants would give them the fairest price for their findings. There was even a social hierarchy among scavengers. The mudlarks were actually considered middle tier. Below them were the pure finders, people who collected dog excrement to sell to leather tanners. Yes, that was an actual job, and we'll talk about that later. Above the mudlarks were the river finders, who had small boats and could scavenge in deeper water. And at the top were the toshers, sewer hunters who ventured into London's underground sewage systems looking for valuables that had been flushed away. We'll meet them later too. The mudlarks occupied this strange space in Victorian consciousness. They were simultaneously invisible and visible. Tourists would stand on London Bridge and point at them, remarking on the curious sight of these ragged children in the mud. Writers described them in articles and books. Artists sometimes painted them. But nobody really did anything to help them. They were entertainment in a way. A spectacle of poverty that made middle-class Londoners feel simultaneously superior and charitable when they dropped a penny to a mudlark child. Some descriptions from the era are telling. The Leamington Spa Courier described mudlarks as a swarm of dirty boys and girls, dressed in clothes that seemed to have been stolen from scarecrows. An Oxford undergraduate writing in 1872 called them little sinners who were spoiling the dairy of London by walking about in embryonic Cockney butter, referring, I think, to the pale mud that coated them. The contempt drips from these descriptions, doesn't it? These were children fighting to survive, and wealthy observers described them like they were some kind of urban vermin. But here's something beautiful that Mayhew recorded. That 9-year-old boy he interviewed? One of Mayhew's friends found the boy a position at a printer's shop, got him out of the mud, gave him a chance to learn a trade. It's just one child out of hundreds, but it's something. It proves that escape was possible, even if it was rare. Not all mudlarks were trapped forever. Some, as they grew older and stronger, managed to transition to other work. They became crossing sweepers, helping pedestrians cross muddy streets in exchange for tips. They became errand boys or porters. A lucky few, very few, learned to read and write and found clerical work. But most remained on the economic margins their entire lives, moving from one desperate occupation to another until injury, illness, or old age finished them off. The mudlarks existed in significant numbers from the late 1700s through the early 1900s. By the 1930s, the occupation had essentially disappeared, not because conditions improved, but because London's riverside economy changed. The great docks moved further east, regulations tightened about scavenging, and the tide of progress, so to speak, washed away the need for children to pick coal from the mud. But here's what I want you to remember about the mudlarks. Yes, their story is tragic. Yes, it's horrifying that a supposedly civilized society allowed children to work in such conditions. But it's also a story about resilience. These children got up every morning, even though their feet hurt and their stomachs were empty, and they did what they had to do to survive. They didn't give up. They didn't lie down and die. They kept searching, kept hoping that today might be the day they found something valuable enough to buy not just bread, but maybe a bit of cheese to go with it. The mudlarks remind us that history isn't just made by kings and queens and great inventors. It's made by thousands of invisible people doing whatever they must to see another sunrise. Their hands built Victorian England just as surely as the hands of engineers and architects. They just built it from the bottom up, one piece of coal at a time. Now, while the mudlarks were searching through the mud for their survival, other women were fighting a different kind of battle entirely. A battle not for bread, but for the right to have their voices heard, their words read, their thoughts taken seriously. But they faced a problem. Their names were wrong. They'd been born with the wrong names, women's names, in a world that refused to take female writers seriously. So they did something remarkable. They became men, at least on paper, and in doing so, they changed literature forever. Imagine holding a secret so carefully guarded that even your closest friends don't know the truth. Imagine creating something extraordinary, something that moves thousands of people to tears, makes them think, changes how they see the world. But you can never claim it as your own. Not really. Not publicly. Because the moment people discover you're a woman, everything you've built will crumble. This was the reality for some of the greatest writers of the Victorian era. Women whose words shaped English literature, whose novels we still read today, whose insights into human nature remain profound more than a century later. But they couldn't use their own names. They had to become men, at least on paper. They had to hide. Let's start with three sisters in a remote parsonage in Yorkshire, 1846. Their names are Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Brontë. They're sitting together in their father's study discussing a secret plan. They've all been writing poems, stories, entire novels, and they want to publish. But they know what happens to lady authors. Their work gets dismissed as frivolous romance, unworthy of serious attention. Male critics openly mock women's writing. Female authors are called authoresses, and the term isn't a compliment. It's said with a sneer, implying something lesser, something not quite legitimate. So the sisters make a decision. They'll publish under male pseudonyms. They choose the surname Bell because it has the same first letter as Bronte, which feels like keeping a piece of themselves. Charlotte becomes Currer Bell, Emily becomes Ellis Bell, Anne becomes Acton Bell. Notice they pick ambiguous first names, names that could be male but sound just foreign or unusual enough that no one will question them too much. Charlotte later explained their reasoning in an 1850 preface, and her words are so telling. She wrote, "We did not like to declare ourselves women, because, without at that time suspecting that our mode of writing and thinking was not what is called feminine, we had a vague impression that authoresses are liable to be looked on with prejudice." A vague impression. That's such gentle language for such a brutal reality. Women writers weren't just looked upon with prejudice, they were systematically dismissed, their work judged not on its merit but on their gender. A novel by a man was literature. The same novel by a woman was dismissed as sentimental, emotional, unsuitable for serious readers. In 1847, Charlotte's Jane Eyre was published under the name Currer Bell, and it was a sensation. Critics praised its power, its originality, its unflinching look at class and morality and independence. They called Currer Bell a bold new voice in English literature. Some thought he must be a man who'd experienced great suffering. Others speculated about his background, his influences, his genius. The same year, Emily published Wuthering Heights as Ellis Bell, and Anne published Agnes Grey as Acton Bell. These three sisters, working in their isolated parsonage, had just given Victorian England some of its greatest literature. But nobody knew they were sisters. Nobody knew they were women. And that anonymity is what allowed their work to be judged fairly, at least initially. When the truth eventually came out, when people discovered that Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell were actually Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, the critical response changed dramatically. Suddenly, Jane Eyre was analysed for its feminine qualities rather than its literary merit. Critics who'd praised Ellis Bell's raw, powerful prose in Wuthering Heights now suggested that such dark themes were inappropriate for a lady to write about. But by then, it was too late. The novels were already beloved. The sisters had proven their talent before the prejudice could stop them. Here's what's fascinating, though. Today, we all know Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre. Emily Bronte's name is firmly attached to Wuthering Heights. Their real names survived. But I want to tell you about another writer whose male pseudonym is still the name most people know her by. A woman whose decision to become George was so successful that even now, more than 140 years after her death, she's primarily remembered as George Eliot. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans. She was born in 1819 in Warwickshire, England, and unlike the Bronte sisters, who were relatively isolated, Mary Ann was right in the thick of London's intellectual scene. She was a translator, an editor, a journalist. She worked for the Westminster Review, one of the most respected periodical publications in England. She knew all the important writers and thinkers of her day. She was respected for her intellect. But she had a problem. Actually, she had two problems. First, she wanted to write fiction, and she knew that her existing reputation as a serious intellectual would prejudice people against her novels. Female novelists in the 1850s were associated with light romances, sentimental stories, happy endings. Mary Ann wanted to write serious fiction, psychological realism, complex moral questions, the kind of dense, thoughtful novels that were considered the exclusive domain of male authors. Second, and this is where Victorian morality gets really interesting, Mary Ann was living with a man named George Henry Lewis, living with him, as in sharing a home, presenting themselves as a married couple, calling herself Marian Evans Lewis. Except they weren't married, because Lewis was already married to someone else. His wife Agnes had had children with another man, and Lewis had accepted them as his own, which legally made divorce impossible under Victorian law, so Lewis and Mary Ann couldn't marry even though they wanted to. Victorian society was scandalized. A woman living openly with a married man? Shocking, disgraceful. Mary Ann found herself socially ostracized. Respectable women wouldn't associate with her. She couldn't attend social gatherings. Her reputation was ruined. So when she decided to publish her first fiction in 1857, 3 short stories in Blackwood's magazine, she chose a pseudonym very carefully. She wanted a plain, common, unremarkable man's name, something that would draw no attention, and she chose the first name George, partly in honour of George Lewis, the man she loved, who'd encouraged her to write fiction in the first place. George Eliot was born, and George Eliot became one of the most celebrated novelists in England. Her first novel, Adam Bede, published in 1859, was an immediate critical and commercial success. It went through 8 printings in its first year. Readers loved it. Critics praised its psychological depth, its moral complexity, its vivid portrayal of rural English life. Everyone wanted to know, who is this George Eliot? There was speculation, of course. Some people guessed the author might be a woman because of certain sensibilities in the writing. But most assumed George Eliot was a man, perhaps a clergyman given the novel's moral concerns, or maybe a country doctor familiar with rural life. Charles Dickens? Yes, that Charles Dickens was so impressed by Adam Bede that he wrote to the publisher. He had his suspicions, he wrote, "If they originated with no woman, I believe that no man ever before had the art of making himself mentally so like a woman." Dickens was both right and revealing something troubling. He could tell the writing had a woman's quality, but he still assumed that if it was this good, it had to be a man imitating a woman. The idea that a woman could actually write this well seemed almost impossible to him. By June 1859, the secret was out. Mary Ann Evans was revealed as George Eliot. And you know what? By then she was too successful to ignore. Yes, there was initial shock. Yes, some readers were disturbed to learn that the author they admired was a woman living in sin. But the books kept selling. The critical acclaim continued. Mary Ann had proven herself before the prejudice could destroy her. She went on to write The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner, and her masterpiece Middlemarch, widely considered one of the greatest novels in the English language. She became so famous that even Queen Victoria was said to be a fan. Princess Louise, Victoria's daughter, requested a meeting with George Eliot in 1877. A princess wanted to meet the scandalous woman living in sin with a married man, because her novels were that good. But here's what strikes me as both sad and triumphant. Mary Ann Evans died in 1880, but George Eliot lives on. Most people today still refer to her as George Eliot. The pseudonym stuck, and there's debate about whether that's right. Should we reclaim her real name, or is George Eliot in some way who she wanted to be? Now let me tell you about someone who took this even further. Her name was Amantine Lucille Aurore Dupin, and she decided that if she was going to be a man on paper, she might as well be a man in public too. Born in France in 1804, Aurore, let's call her that for now, married a nobleman named Baron Casimir Dudevant. The marriage was miserable. The Baron was controlling, possibly abusive, and certainly didn't understand his wife's intellectual ambitions. So Aurore did something radical. She left him, got a legal separation, moved to Paris, and started a new life. She adopted the pen name George Sand. George again. It must have been the most trustworthy man's name available. And George Sand didn't just write under a male name, she wore men's clothing. Trousers, jackets, men's coats. She smoked cigars in public. She had love affairs with famous men, and possibly with women too. She was one of the most famous writers in Europe, and she was absolutely scandalous. When the composer Frédéric Chopin first met her, he asked his friend Franz Liszt whether Sand was in fact a woman. That's how convincing her male persona was. And yet, everyone knew. It was an open secret. George Sand was a woman dressing as a man, writing as a man, living as a man. But everyone was in on the joke. Except it wasn't really a joke. It was a brilliant strategy. By making her gender performance so obvious, so theatrical, she somehow made it acceptable. She was too bold to ignore, too talented to dismiss. Gustave Flaubert, one of France's greatest novelists, adored her. He once told the Russian novelist Turgenev, "At her funeral I cried like an ass." That's love, right there. George Sand's novels sold throughout Europe and America. She wrote over 70 novels in her lifetime. 70. And many of them dealt with themes of female independence, unhappy marriages, and social reform. She was using her male name and male clothing to write about women's experiences in ways that a female author never could have gotten published. But perhaps the strangest and most touching story of female writers hiding behind a male name is this. Two women who wrote together as one man. Catherine Harris Bradley and her niece, Edith Emma Cooper. They adopted the pseudonym Michael Field, and they wrote poetry and plays together under that single male name for nearly 40 years. Here's the remarkable part. Catherine and Edith weren't just co-writers, they were lovers. Aunt and niece, 16 years apart in age, living together, writing together, and deeply in love with each other. Their poetry often explored themes of female same-sex desire, incredibly bold for Victorian England, and yet because everyone thought Michael Field was a man, their work was accepted, published, praised by major male writers like Robert Browning and Walter Pater. The two women died within 9 months of each other, both from cancer, in 1913 and 1914. They'd kept their secret for decades. Michael Field was so convincing that most readers never questioned it. And in a way, Michael Field was real. It was the persona that allowed two women who loved each other to create art together in a world that would have destroyed them if it knew the truth. Do you see the pattern here? These women didn't use male pseudonyms because they were ashamed of being women. They used them because they knew the game was rigged. They knew that prejudice would blind readers and critics to the quality of their work. So they changed the rules. They wrote as men, proved their talent, and then, sometimes, revealed the truth. And it worked. It actually worked. Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Anne Bronte, Marianne Evans, Aurore Dupin, Catherine Bradley, Edith Cooper. These women changed literature. Their novels and poems are still read, still taught, still considered masterpieces. They won the game by refusing to play it honestly. But here's what troubles me. In 2015, just a few years ago, a writer named Catherine Nichols did an experiment. She sent out the same cover letter and manuscript to literary agents twice, once under her real female name, once under a male pseudonym she invented. The result? She received 8.5 times more responses when agents thought she was a man. 8.5 times in 2015. We like to think we've moved past all this. We like to believe that talent is recognized regardless of gender, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Female writers today still face prejudice, still have to work harder to be taken seriously, still see their work dismissed as women's fiction if it deals with relationships or emotions. The Victorian women who became George changed literature, but they didn't change everything. Not yet. Their courage opened doors, yes, but some doors remain closed, or at least harder for women to open. Still, I find their stories inspiring. These women looked at a system designed to silence them, and they found a way to speak anyway. They couldn't use their own voices, so they borrowed voices that would be heard. And in doing so, they preserved their actual voices for us. We can read Mary Ann Evans' thoughts because George Eliot wrote them down. We can experience Emily Bronte's wild imagination because Ellis Bell published Wuthering Heights. They hid to be seen. They lied to tell the truth. And they did it all with words, the very thing they were told women couldn't handle properly. While these literary women were fighting to have their ideas taken seriously, other women were fighting a very different battle, a battle for enough food to survive another day. Because not all Victorian women's work involved sitting at a desk with a pen. Some of it involved sitting at a sewing machine for 20 hours straight, fingers bleeding, eyes straining, creating the beautiful dresses that wealthy ladies would wear for a single evening. The dressmakers, the seamstresses, the women who quite literally sewed their lives away. There's a peculiar cruelty in creating beauty while your own body falls apart, in making something exquisite with hands that tremble from exhaustion, in sewing perfection with eyes that can barely focus anymore. And yet, that's exactly what hundreds of thousands of Victorian women did, day after day, stitch after stitch, until their bodies simply couldn't continue. Welcome to the world of the dressmakers. It looks more respectable than the match factories, doesn't it? No toxic phosphorus here. No mud from the Thames. Just fabric and thread and needles. How dangerous could that be? The answer might surprise you. It's April in London, 1862. The social season is beginning, which means every wealthy lady in the city needs new gowns. Not just one or two, dozens. A morning dress for receiving visitors, an afternoon dress for promenading in the park, an evening gown for dinner parties, a ball gown for dancing, riding habits, walking costumes, morning attire if someone in the family has died. And each of these garments is an engineering marvel, multiple layers, intricate construction, hundreds of tiny stitches, all sewn by hand. Where do these dresses come from? From dressmaking establishments scattered throughout London and every other major city. And who makes them? Women. Almost exclusively women. According to the 1851 census, 267,000 women worked in dressmaking and millinery. By 1871, that number had grown to 300,000. This was the second largest employer of women in all of England, right after domestic service. Let me take you inside one of these establishments. It's a fairly typical one in London's West End, serving upper-middle-class clients. The workroom is on the top floor, the attic really, where the light is best. There are about 30 seamstresses here, ranging in age from 14 to 40. They sit on backless benches, hunched over their work, fingers moving with mechanical precision. The room is stuffy. There's a fireplace, but it's not lit because fabric is expensive and fire is dangerous, so in winter they work in the cold. In summer, like now, The heat under the roof is suffocating. It's 7 in the morning. These women have been here since 6. They'll leave around 10 tonight. A 16-hour day. But this is April, remember. This season is just beginning. By May, when things get truly busy, these hours will stretch. 18 hours, 20 hours. Sometimes they'll work through the entire night. There's testimony from this era that's absolutely chilling. A government inquiry in the mid-1800s collected statements from dressmakers about their working conditions. One woman explained, "During the fashionable season, that is from April until the latter end of July, it frequently happens that the ordinary hours are greatly exceeded. If there is a drawing room or grand fete or mourning to be made, it often happens that the work goes on for 20 hours out of the 24, occasionally all night. All night. These women would work from dawn one day until dawn the next day, with perhaps an hour or two of sleep snatched on the workroom floor, and then continue working." The testimony continues, and this is where it breaks your heart. The general result of the long hours and sedentary occupation is to impair seriously and very frequently to destroy the health of the young women. The digestion especially suffers, and also the lungs. Pain to the side is very common, and the hands and feet die away from want of circulation and exercise, never seeing the outside of the door from Sunday to Sunday. Never seeing the outside of the door from Sunday to Sunday. These women were prisoners essentially. They lived above the shop or in nearby lodgings, and during the season they literally didn't go outside. They woke up, worked, slept a few hours and worked again. No fresh air, no exercise, no sunlight, just endless sewing. And why? Why this brutal pace? The testimony gives us the answer. One cause is the short time which is allowed by ladies to have their dresses made. Think about that. A wealthy lady would come in, see a dress design and say, "I need this for Lady Pemberton's ball on Friday." It was Tuesday. The dressmaker couldn't say no. She'd lose the client to a competitor. So she'd accept the commission, knowing it meant her seamstresses would work 48 hours straight to complete it. The wealthy ladies creating this demand had no idea, or didn't care, that their impatience was literally killing the women who served them. A dress that could reasonably take 2 weeks to make properly was being demanded in 3 days, and the seamstresses paid the price with their bodies. The health consequences were severe and specific. The testimony mentions digestive problems. These came from irregular meals eaten too quickly while still working. Lung problems developed from sitting in one position in poorly ventilated rooms, breathing in fabric fibres and dust. The pain to the side was likely pleurisy or chronic muscle strain, and the hands and feet dying away. That's what we'd now recognise as nerve damage and circulation problems from repetitive stress and maintaining unnatural positions for hours on end. But here's what really emphasises the desperation of these women. The testimony states, if one vacancy were to occur now, there would be 20 applicants for it. 20 women competing for one job that's slowly destroying the health of whoever holds it. That's how few options women had. That's how valuable even a miserable position was. And the wages? The testimony says simply, the wages generally are very low. Another part of the inquiry concluded, no men could endure the work enforced from the dressmakers. Let that sink in. Government officials acknowledged that men couldn't survive the working conditions that were considered acceptable for women. It wasn't that women were naturally better suited to this work. It was that society considered women's health and lives less valuable. Now, dressmaking establishments at least offered some structure, however brutal. But many women worked as seamstresses from their own homes, and their situation was often worse. These were the women working in what the Victorians called sweated industries, a term that perfectly captures the exploitation involved. A home seamstress would receive piecework from a factory or middleman. She'd be given fabric and thread, told what to make, and paid by the piece. Maybe 3p for a shirt, 6p for a pair of trousers. The pay was so low that she'd have to work 12 or 14 hours a day just to earn enough for rent and food. And here's the cruelest detail. Most of these women had to rent their sewing machines. If you couldn't afford to buy a machine outright, and most couldn't, you paid weekly rental fees that ate up a significant portion of your earnings. The machine companies made a fortune from this arrangement. The women, already working for starvation wages, had to pay for the privilege of working. The House of Commons defined sweated industries in 1890 as work carried on for inadequate wages and for excessive hours in unsanitary conditions. By 1906, a government investigation found that women in these industries earned about a penny an hour. A penny. At that rate, you'd need to work 12 hours just to earn a shilling, and you needed roughly 12 to 15 shillings a week to survive at the most basic level. The mathematics of survival didn't work. It was impossible to make enough money. So women cut corners in their own lives. They'd buy the cheapest food, usually just bread and tea, maybe a bit of margarine if they were lucky. They'd rent the smallest, dimmest rooms in the worst neighbourhoods. They'd go without heat in winter, wear the same clothes until they fell apart, never see a doctor no matter how sick they became. And still, it wasn't enough. Many seamstresses ended up supplementing their income through prostitution. It wasn't a choice they wanted to make, but when the alternative is watching your children starve, morality becomes a luxury you can't afford. The link between sweated labour and prostitution was well documented by Victorian social reformers, though they rarely acknowledged that it was the economic system itself forcing women into these choices. There's a particular type of needlework that deserves mention: the creation of elaborate mourning clothes. When someone died in a wealthy Victorian family, everyone went into deep mourning. This meant entirely new wardrobes, black dresses with specific details, veils, gloves, accessories. And these had to be made quickly, because mourning began immediately. The seamstresses who specialized in mourning work faced the darkest irony imaginable. They worked through the night to create clothes for people grieving a death, while their own health deteriorated from the labor. They sewed black crepe, a fabric that shed toxic fibers as you worked with it, making it even more dangerous than regular fabric, until their lungs filled with black dust. They were creating symbols of death while slowly dying themselves. Have you ever thought about the clothes you wear? Who made them? Under what conditions? It's easy to forget, isn't it, that every garment was touched by human hands somewhere along the line. Victorian ladies forgot too, or chose not to think about it. They admired themselves in mirrors, their beautiful gowns perfect in every detail, never considering the young woman who'd gone blind from close needlework by candlelight to create those perfect stitches. Now, I want to tell you about a specific case that came to public attention. Her name was Mary Walkley, and she was a dressmaker at a fashionable establishment. In June of 1863, at the height of the season, Mary worked for 26.5 hours straight. 26.5 hours. She was making ball gowns for ladies who'd be attending parties celebrating the marriage of the Prince of Wales. After that shift, Mary finally got a break. She went to bed in the crowded room she shared with other seamstresses, and she never woke up. She died in her sleep, at 20 years old, from what we'd now recognize as exhaustion and probably heart failure. Her death created a scandal. The newspapers covered it. There were calls for reform, and you know what changed? Almost nothing. Some establishments made token improvements. Working hours were theoretically limited, but the limits were rarely enforced. The season still demanded impossible turnaround times. Ladies still wanted their dresses in 3 days instead of 3 weeks. Mary Walkley's death did accomplish one thing, though. It made the invisible visible, at least briefly. For a moment, wealthy Victorians had to confront the human cost of their beautiful clothes. Some felt guilty, some changed their behaviour, giving dressmakers more time and paying higher prices. But most simply forgot and went back to their old habits. The dressmaking trade encompassed many specialties beyond just dresses. There were milliners making hats, intricate constructions of wire, fabric, feathers and flowers that took days to complete. There were glovers cutting and sewing the delicate gloves that ladies wore everywhere. There were corset makers constructing the elaborate undergarments that shaped Victorian silhouettes, using boning and lacing that required incredible precision. There were collar makers, cuff makers, trimming makers, lace makers, embroiderers, each specialty its own world of exhausting underpaid labour. And here's something that might surprise you. Despite the terrible conditions, many women took pride in their work. A skilled dressmaker or milliner was an artist in her way. She understood fabric, drape, proportion, colour. She could look at a sketch and figure out how to make it real. She could solve complex construction problems. This wasn't mindless labour. It required intelligence, creativity, and years of experience. But that skill was never properly valued or compensated. A male tailor doing similar work earned significantly more than a female dressmaker. A male craftsman in almost any trade had better hours, better pay, better conditions than women doing comparable work. The difference wasn't skill or effort, it was simply gender. The dressmaking industry did eventually improve, but change came slowly. The introduction of electric sewing machines in the late Victorian era made some aspects easier. Labour laws gradually, very gradually, started to limit working hours. The growth of ready-to-wear clothing in the 20th century reduced demand for custom dressmaking. But these changes took decades, and in the meantime, hundreds of thousands of women spent their youth, and often their lives, bent over needlework, creating beauty they could never afford to wear themselves. I find myself thinking about those seamstresses when I look at museum displays of Victorian fashion. Those incredible dresses preserved behind glass, objects of admiration and historical interest. They're beautiful, yes, but they're also monuments to suffering. Every ruffle, every tuck, every tiny decorative stitch represents hours of a woman's life spent in pain and exhaustion. Those dresses are gorgeous. They're also graveyards. The next time you hear someone romanticize the Victorian era, the elegance, the refinement, the beautiful clothes, remember the women who made those clothes. Remember the 16-hour days and the hands that went numb from repetitive motion. Remember Mary Walkley, who died at 20 making dresses for a royal wedding she'd never attend. Remember that Victorian elegance was built on the backs of women who were never allowed to be elegant themselves. But we're not done exploring the hidden dangers of Victorian fashion, because while some women were sewing beautiful clothes, others were wearing clothes that were quite literally poisonous. Garments dyed with arsenic, hats made with mercury, fabrics that could spontaneously burst into flames. Victorian fashion didn't just exploit the women who made it, it also killed the women who wore it. And that story, that deadly intersection of vanity and chemistry, is where we're heading next. Picture yourself at a glittering Victorian ball. The year is 1863. Candlelight catches on crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across the room. And there, sweeping across the floor in a waltz, is the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. Her gown is breathtaking, a brilliant, vivid green that seems to glow in the candlelight. Emerald silk adorned with artificial flowers in her hair, matching the exact shade of her dress. She's radiant. She's stunning. She's also wearing poison. That gorgeous green colour? It's Sheely's green, or perhaps the even more vibrant Paris green. Both are pigments created with arsenic, and that woman, that beautiful, elegant lady, is slowly being poisoned by her own clothing. So is everyone who touches her. So are the women who made her dress, who handled that fabric for hours, breathing in arsenic dust with every stitch. Welcome to the bizarre and deadly world of Victorian fashion, where looking good could quite literally kill you. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian Britain, and I mean everywhere. It was cheap, it was abundant, and it had this wonderful property of creating the most spectacular colours, especially greens. Before arsenic dyes, getting a bright, stable green was nearly impossible. Plant-based dyes faded quickly, but arsenic green, permanent, vivid, absolutely gorgeous. So manufacturers put it in everything. Wallpaper. Imagine your nursery walls coated in arsenic. Curtains, artificial flowers, fabric for dresses, gloves, shoes, stockings, ribbons, decorative wreaths. If it was green and made after about 1814, it probably contained arsenic. And we're not talking about trace amounts. Some fabrics contained up to 60 grams of arsenic per square metre. 60 grams. That's enough to kill approximately 500 people if ingested. Now you might be thinking, well, they're not eating their dresses, so what's the problem? And that's where it gets interesting and horrifying. Because arsenic doesn't just poison you if you swallow it. It can be absorbed through your skin, and it definitely poisons you if you breathe it in as dust or vapour. Women wearing arsenic-dyed clothing developed rashes, particularly on their arms and chest where the fabric touched bare skin. Their eyes became inflamed. They experienced headaches, nausea, digestive problems. Some developed more serious symptoms: muscle weakness, numbness in their extremities, difficulty breathing. And they had no idea why they were sick. They'd blame it on female hysteria, or weak constitutions, or the weather, never on their beautiful green dress. But the women wearing the clothes had it easy compared to the women making them. The workers in factories producing arsenic-dyed fabrics, the seamstresses cutting and sewing the material, the artificial flower makers shaping petals from arsenic-coated fabric. These women were exposed to arsenic dust constantly. They breathed it. It settled on their hands, their faces, their hair. They brought it home on their clothes, poisoning their families. The artificial flower makers had it especially bad. These were women, often working from home, who created the elaborate floral decorations that adorned Victorian dresses and hats. They'd take fabric petals, dip them in arsenic solution to colour them, let them dry, then assemble them into wreaths and bouquets. Hour after hour, handling poison with their bare hands, breathing poison dust in their small, poorly ventilated rooms. Many developed severe skin conditions, sores that wouldn't heal, rashes that spread. Some lost their sense of taste and smell, some went blind, and some, of course, died. Arsenic poisoning looks like a lot of other illnesses, so deaths were often attributed to consumption, or fever, or natural causes. The true culprit remained hidden. Here's what absolutely baffles me. This wasn't a secret. People knew arsenic was poisonous. It was actually one of the most popular murder weapons in Victorian England because it was so easy to obtain and so effective. There were famous murder trials involving arsenic. Everyone knew it could kill you. And yet, fashion manufacturers kept using it, and women kept wearing it, because it was beautiful, because green was fashionable, because appearing elegant and stylish was more important than safety. The risk seemed abstract, distant, but looking unfashionable. That was a real immediate social disaster. There were warnings, some doctors spoke out, some newspapers ran articles about the dangers of arsenic dyes. In 1862, a prominent British medical journal published a piece about a woman who'd worn an artificial flower wreath in her hair. The arsenic caused her scalp to erupt in painful sores, but she wasn't alone. The article mentioned that many women suffered similar reactions. The remedy suggested? Stop wearing arsenic flowers. Revolutionary advice, right? But most women didn't stop, partly because they didn't know their specific dress or wreath contained arsenic. There were no labels, no warnings, no regulations requiring disclosure, and partly because fashion demanded it. If arsenic green was in style, you wore arsenic green. End of discussion. Now let me tell you about another fashion poison that was even more insidious. Mercury. This one primarily affected the people making fashionable items rather than wearing them, though everyone was at risk to some degree. Mercury was essential in hat making. Here's how it worked. To make felt for men's hats, those elegant top hats and bowlers you see in Victorian photographs, manufacturers used fur from rabbits and hares. But raw fur doesn't naturally stick together to form felt, so hatters would brush the fur with a mercury solution. This made the fibres mat together beautifully, creating smooth, high-quality felt. The problem? Mercury vapour. When you brush liquid mercury onto fur, especially in the heated workshops where this was done, mercury evaporates into the air, and hatters breathe that air all day, every day, for years. Mercury poisoning causes neurological damage. The symptoms are distinctive and terrible. Tremors. Hatters would develop shaking hands that made their work increasingly difficult. Mood swings and irritability. Memory loss. Difficulty speaking clearly. In severe cases, hallucinations and dementia. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from this occupational hazard. The Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. Not just a whimsical character, a reference to a real phenomenon of hatters losing their minds from mercury poisoning. And the truly appalling part? The British government never banned mercury in hat making, never. You know when mercury hat making finally stopped? The 1960s. Not because of regulations, but because men's hats went out of fashion. When fewer men wore hats, demand dropped, mercury hatting declined, and the problem solved itself. Hundreds of years of poisoning hatters, and what ended it was changing fashion trends, not concern for human health. But wait, there's more. Because Victorian fashion had yet another deadly surprise: spontaneous combustion. Well, not exactly spontaneous, but close enough to be terrifying. Victorian women's dresses were fire hazards. The enormous skirts, first supported by layers of petticoats, later by crinoline cages, then by bustles, created these massive flowing constructions that dragged on the ground and swept near any open flame. And remember, this was before electric lighting. Homes were lit by candles, oil lamps and fireplaces. The combination was deadly. Women's clothes caught fire with horrifying regularity. There are newspaper reports from the era documenting death after death. Woman killed when dress caught fire from candle. That he burned to death when gown brushed fireplace. Young woman's dress ignited by oil lamp. It's almost monotonous reading through them, except each one represents a woman who burned alive, often in front of her family, often while screaming for help that couldn't save her. The fabrics made it worse. Thin cotton and tulle, popular for evening gowns, burned extremely quickly. Once ignited, these dresses would be engulfed in seconds, and the design of the dresses made escape nearly impossible. All those layers, all that fabric, often with tight bodices that couldn't be quickly removed. Women would try to tear off their burning clothes and find they couldn't. The more they moved, the more air fed the flames. Men's clothing, by contrast, was much safer. Tighter-fitting wool trousers and jackets, less fabric, denser weave, wool being naturally fire-resistant. Men died in fires too, of course, but far less frequently from their clothing catching fire. This was a uniquely female danger, created entirely by fashion. And then there's my personal favourite example of Victorian fashion madness: celluloid combs. In the late 1800s, celluloid, an early plastic, became popular for making decorative hair combs. These were beautiful, affordable, and they looked like tortoiseshell or ivory. Women wore them constantly, decorating their elaborate upswept hairstyles. Small problem: celluloid is highly flammable. Not just flammable, explosive. If a celluloid comb got too hot, say from being near a lamp or in direct sunlight, it could spontaneously ignite or even explode. There are reports of women's hair catching fire from their combs. One newspaper reported that a man in Brooklyn died while caring for his long grey beard when his celluloid comb exploded. Yes, men wore them too. Yes, this actually happened. There was even a celluloid comb factory explosion in the United States that destroyed the entire facility. But did manufacturers stop making celluloid combs? Did women stop buying them? Nope. They were pretty and cheap, so the risk seemed acceptable. Do you see the pattern here? Victorian fashion was literally killing people. The women wearing it, the workers making it, even the occasional man with an exploding comb. And yet it continued because beauty and social status mattered more than safety. Now, here's where I need to make a connection that might make you uncomfortable. We like to think we're past all this. We like to believe that today, in our enlightened modern age, we'd never accept such dangerous conditions. But are we sure about that? Where are your clothes made? Under what conditions? With what chemicals? The global fashion industry still uses dyes and treatments that are dangerous to workers. Sandblasting denim, a process to create that trendy, distressed look, causes silicosis, a deadly lung disease. Workers in some countries are still exposed to toxic chemicals with minimal protection. Factories still catch fire, killing dozens of workers because safety regulations are expensive and fashion is cheap. The distance has just increased. Victorian ladies could potentially visit the workshops where their dresses were made. You and I will probably never see the factories where our clothes originate. The suffering is offshore, invisible, easy to ignore, but it's still there. I'm not trying to guilt you. Well, maybe a little. But mostly I'm suggesting that the Victorian arsenic lady isn't as far in the past as we'd like to believe. The same calculations are still being made. Beauty and affordability versus worker safety. Convenience versus human cost. And usually in fashion, beauty wins. But let's return to Victorian England, because we're not done with the deadly occupations yet. We've talked about women poisoned by phosphorus, working in mud, hiding behind male names, sewing until they collapsed, and wearing poison for beauty. But there's another group of women whose work was so strange, so unpleasant, and yet so necessary that I almost hesitate to describe it. These were women who used their own bodies as bait, who allowed parasites to feed on them, who walked through marshes and streams, offering their legs as meals for blood-sucking creatures, the leech collectors. And their story is somehow both revolting and heartbreaking. Some jobs demand your time, some demand your strength, and some demand your blood. Literally. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing in a marshy field in rural England. It's early morning, summer of 1850. The air is thick with moisture, and mist rises from standing water that stretches before you. You're wearing a simple dress. You've hitched the skirts up around your waist because where you're going, modesty is a luxury you can't afford. Your legs are bare, your feet are bare, and you're about to wade into that murky water and stand there, perfectly still, waiting for something to attach itself to your skin and start drinking your blood. This is your job. You're a leech collector, and those little vampire worms clinging to your legs are your paycheck. Welcome to one of the strangest and most unsettling occupations in all of Victorian England. And yes, this was done almost exclusively by women. Poor women, desperate women, women who needed money so badly that they were willing to become living bait. Let me explain how this worked, because it's both ingenious and horrifying. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medical practice was dominated by a theory called humorism. Doctors believed that illness came from an imbalance of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The solution to almost any ailment? Remove some blood to restore balance. This practice was called bloodletting, and it was everywhere. Headache? Bloodletting. Fever? Bloodletting. Hysteria in women, which was basically Victorian medicine's catch-all term for any female complaint. Definitely bloodletting. And the preferred method for bloodletting? Leeches. These small segmented worms would attach to your skin, make a tiny incision, and drink your blood. They'd swell up like tiny balloons, gorging themselves, and then naturally detach when full. From a medical perspective, from a Victorian medical perspective, leeches were perfect. They removed blood cleanly, without the mess and risk of cutting open veins. They could be applied to specific areas, and patients generally tolerated them better than having a surgeon slice into them with a lancet. The demand for leeches was enormous. Every doctor wanted them. Every hospital needed them. Apothecaries sold them. Wealthy people kept them at home for family use. At the peak of leech therapy in the mid-19th century, France alone was importing about 40 million leeches per year. 40 million. That's not a typo. Britain's numbers were similarly staggering. Estimates suggest tens of millions of leeches were used annually. And where did all these leeches come from? Someone had to catch them. Enter the leech collectors. These were usually country women, often widows or women whose husbands couldn't work. The job was seasonal, peaking in summer when leeches were most active. Here's how it worked. A leech collector would go to a known leech habitat: marshes, slow-moving streams, ponds, shallow riverbeds. She'd wade in, barefoot and bare-legged, and then she'd just stand there, waiting, sometimes for hours. Leeches are attracted to movement and warmth. They sense vibrations in the water, so the collector had to stay relatively still, letting the leeches find her. When they did, they'd latch onto her legs, her feet, sometimes her hands if she'd put them in the water. The collector would wait until the leech had attached firmly. You didn't want to pull them off too early or they'd drop back into the water. Then, carefully, she'd pluck them off and put them in a container, a jar or a cloth bag, something to keep them alive until she could sell them. On a good day, a skilled collector might gather 50 leeches. On an exceptional day, maybe 100. The payment varied, but generally you'd get a few pence per leech, so 100 leeches might earn you 8 to 10 shillings. Decent money for a day's work in rural areas. But remember, this was seasonal work. You couldn't collect leeches in winter when they were dormant, and not every day was productive. Sometimes you'd stand in cold water for hours and come away with just a handful. Now what do you think were the health consequences of this work? Because there were many, and they were serious. First, the obvious: blood loss. Each leech drinks about 5 to 15 milliliters of blood. Doesn't sound like much, right? But multiply that by 50 or 100 leeches in a single day. And remember, these women were doing this repeatedly throughout the season. Chronic blood loss leads to anemia, fatigue, weakness, dizziness, pale skin. Many leech collectors were perpetually exhausted and malnourished, their bodies unable to replace the blood they were losing. Second, infection. Leech bites can become infected, especially when you're standing in stagnant marsh water full of bacteria. The leeches themselves can carry disease, and in an era before antibiotics, a simple infection could become life-threatening. Leech collectors often had their legs covered in bite marks that wouldn't heal properly, festering sores that wept and ached. Third, and this is the darkest irony, the leeches could transmit diseases between people. Think about it. A leech feeds on one person, someone sick perhaps, and then that same leech is sold to a doctor who applies it to another patient. Any blood-borne pathogens could theoretically be transmitted. Victorian doctors didn't understand germ theory, so they'd use the same leech on multiple patients, or they'd pool leeches together, creating perfect conditions for cross-contamination. The leech collectors were at the center of this disease transmission network. They'd have leeches feeding on them, then those leeches would be sold and applied to sick people, potentially picking up infections, and then, because leeches were often reused, those same leeches might end up back in the marshes where new collectors would encounter them. It's a miracle more people didn't get seriously ill from this system. There's also the psychological aspect that I think we overlook. Imagine making your living by allowing parasites to feed on you, by commodifying your own blood, by turning your body into a product. That has to do something to your sense of self, doesn't it? You're not selling your labor, not exactly. You're selling pieces of yourself, your literal life force, one leech at a time. And society viewed leech collectors with a mixture of fascination and disgust. They were necessary. Doctors needed those leeches, but they were also considered sort of contaminated, tainted by their association with blood and parasites. Respectable women wouldn't socialize with leech collectors. They were seen as belonging to a lower order of humanity, people who do anything for money, even this. But here's what I find remarkable. The women who did this work developed real expertise. They knew where to find leeches. They understood leech behavior, which species were medicinal, which weren't. They knew how to keep leeches alive during transport, how to store them when they were healthy versus sick. This was skilled work, requiring knowledge passed down through generations. Some families have been leech collecting for decades, teaching daughters and granddaughters the trade. There were even different species of leeches, and collectors had to know the difference. The medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was the valuable one. It has 3 jaws with tiny teeth that create a Y-shaped incision. But there were other species in British waters that looked similar but weren't as effective for medical purposes. A good collector could identify species by sight, by behavior, by the way they attached. That's expertise, that's skill. But it was never recognized or valued as such because the work was considered degrading. The irony is that leech therapy was based on completely incorrect medical theory. Bloodletting didn't cure headaches or fevers or hysteria. In fact, it often made people worse by weakening them. Doctors were applying leeches to sick patients, removing blood that their bodies needed to fight illness, and women were sacrificing their health to collect leeches for a medical practice that was actively harmful. We know this now, of course. Modern medicine abandoned bloodletting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as germ theory and scientific methodology revealed how the body actually works. Leeches do have some legitimate medical uses today, They're still used in certain surgical procedures to reduce venous congestion and promote blood flow. But the Victorian practice of applying leeches to treat every ailment under the sun, completely debunked. Which means all those women standing in cold water, offering their legs to parasites, damaging their health for pennies, they were suffering for nothing, for a medical superstition, for a treatment that was at best useless and at worst actively harmful. And yet, I don't want to diminish what these women did. They were surviving. They found a way to earn money in an economy that offered them almost no opportunities. Was it degrading? Yes. Was it dangerous? Absolutely. But it was also creative, in a strange way. Someone figured out that you could use your own body as bait, that you could turn a natural resource into income, that you could make leeches valuable. That's entrepreneurial thinking, even if the business model was your own blood. The leech collecting trade declined in the late 19th century for two reasons. First, medical practice changed. As bloodletting fell out of favour, demand for leeches plummeted. Second, leech populations crashed from over-harvesting. Collectors had been so successful, had captured so many leeches, that wild populations couldn't sustain themselves. The medicinal leech actually became endangered in parts of Europe, so the occupation destroyed itself. It became so efficient that it eliminated the resource it depended on. Some former leech collectors moved into other work: seasonal agricultural labour, laundry work, domestic service. All difficult jobs, but at least none of them involved standing waist-deep in marsh water while parasites drained your blood. You know what strikes me about leech collecting? It's the perfect metaphor for how Victorian society treated poor women. It extracted value from their bodies, gave them almost nothing in return, viewed them with contempt for doing exactly what they had to do to survive, and then discarded them when they were no longer useful. The leech collectors were leeches, in society's view, parasites living off the medical trade. But who was really parasitizing whom? The women standing in cold water, risking illness and infection for a few pennies, or the system that offered them no better options and then judged them for their choices? I'll let you decide. Now, the leech collectors worked in the countryside, in marshes and streams where nature provided the resources they needed. But back in the cities, back in the industrial heart of Victorian England, other women faced different kinds of dangers. They worked in factories where the air itself was poison, where the substances they handled could kill them slowly from the inside out. They worked with lead and chemicals and toxic dust. They worked in trades so dangerous that the government eventually had to step in, though not quickly enough to save everyone. These were the women in what the Victorians themselves called the dangerous trades, and their stories reveal just how little a woman's life was worth when profit was at stake. Step inside a pottery factory in Staffordshire, England. The year is 1890. The air here has a quality you can almost see, a haze of fine dust that hangs suspended in the light streaming through grimy windows. Every breath you take fills your lungs with particles of clay, silica, lead. The women working here, and there are dozens of them, have dust settled in their hair, on their eyelashes, coating their skin. They've stopped noticing it years ago. It's just part of the job. By the time these women reach 40, many of them will be dead. The lucky ones will merely be disabled, coughing constantly, struggling to breathe, their lungs scarred into uselessness by decades of inhaling poison. This is what the Victorians called the dangerous trades, and the shocking part isn't that these jobs existed, it's that everyone knew how dangerous they were, documented the deaths meticulously, and did almost nothing to stop it. Let's talk about lead. Beautiful, versatile, deadly lead. The Victorians used it for everything: paint, pottery glaze, cosmetics, water pipes, and someone had to work with it. Many someones, often women. White lead factories were particularly notorious. White lead, basic lead carbonate, was used to create the brilliant white paint that covered so many Victorian homes and products. The manufacturing process involved exposing lead to acetic acid fumes, which created this pure, white powder. And that powder got everywhere, in the air, on the workers' clothes, on their skin, in their lungs. Women in white lead factories developed a distinctive set of symptoms that doctors came to recognize immediately. It started with the lead line, a dark blue line that appeared along the gums where lead had accumulated. Then came the abdominal pain, so severe that workers would double over, unable to stand. Constipation alternating with diarrhea, muscle weakness, and then, in the worst cases, something doctors called wrist drop. The hands would lose their strength, hanging limply, unable to grip or lift anything. Lead had damaged the nerves so severely that the muscles simply stopped responding. Some women developed lead palsy, where their entire bodies would shake uncontrollably. Others went blind. Still others experienced severe cognitive decline, memory loss, confusion, personality changes. Lead poisoning affects the brain, you see. It crosses the blood-brain barrier and interferes with neurotransmitters. Victorian doctors didn't understand the mechanism, but they certainly saw the effects. And here's what makes this especially cruel. Many of these women were of childbearing age. Lead accumulates in bones, and during pregnancy, it can be released into the bloodstream and cross the placenta. Lead-poisoned women had higher rates of miscarriage and stillbirth. Their babies, if born alive, often had developmental problems. The poison passed from mother to child, a toxic inheritance. But women kept working in lead factories because the alternative was starvation, and factory owners kept employing them because lead work was profitable, and women could be paid less than men for the same job. Now, let's visit a different kind of hell, a textile mill in Lancashire. The year is 1875. The temperature in the cotton spinning room is kept deliberately high, somewhere between 84 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. In the linen mills it's even worse, between 120 and 140 degrees. Why so hot? Because cotton and linen fibres work better at high temperatures and humidity. The threads break less. The fabric quality improves. And if the workers collapse from heat exhaustion, well, that's unfortunate, but there are always more workers. The air in these mills is thick with fluff, tiny fibres floating everywhere, coating the lungs of everyone who works there. Carding rooms where raw cotton is combed and aligned are the worst. The dust is so thick you can barely see across the room. Women work here for years, breathing this air until their lungs simply give up. They develop what we'd now call occupational lung disease, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, textile workers' pneumoconiosis. And the wet spinning process for linen? Women stood barefoot on wet floors in that steamy hot atmosphere, soaked to the waist for 12-hour shifts. The combination of heat, moisture, and standing in water led to fungal infections, skin conditions, respiratory problems, and circulatory issues. Their feet would develop sores that never healed. Their legs would swell. But stopping work meant losing pay, and losing pay meant not eating. Here's something that haunted me when I learned about it. The testimony from one government inquiry described the ventilation in these factories as poor, the air as vitiated, meaning corrupted, made poisonous by the fluff and dust. The report noted that workers in the picking rooms where cotton was initially processed ate their meals at their workstations. They were literally eating particles of cotton fibre with their bread because there was nowhere else to go. Think about that. Your workplace air is so contaminated that your food becomes contaminated, and you have to eat it anyway because taking a break to go somewhere cleaner would mean losing production time and losing wages. But at least textile workers were working above ground. Some women had it worse, much worse. Before the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, women and girls worked in coal mines, underground, in conditions that are almost impossible to comprehend. These women were called hurriers or drawers. Their job was to drag coal wagons through the narrow mine tunnels from the coal face to the shaft, where the coal could be hauled to the surface. Imagine crawling through a tunnel barely 3 feet high, harnessed like a horse, pulling a cart loaded with coal that weighs as much as you do. The tunnel is pitch black except for the small lamp you carry. The air is thick with coal dust. Water drips from the ceiling, sometimes rising to your knees on the tunnel floor. You do this for 12 hours, sometimes 14, starting when you're 10 years old, if your family needs the money badly enough, and many families did. The Mines and Collieries Act banned women and girls from working underground, which sounds progressive until you realize it didn't ban child labor entirely. Boys could still work in the mines, and it didn't help the women who'd been working underground for years, whose lungs were already damaged, whose backs were permanently bent from crawling through low tunnels. Where were they supposed to go? What were they supposed to do? In Wolverhampton, the law had minimal impact anyway because women there mainly worked above ground at the coal mines, sorting coal, loading canal boats, hauling materials. Still dangerous, still exhausting, but at least under the sky. Small mercies, right? There were also women working in chemical factories, producing the acids, alkalis and other substances that Victorian industry demanded. These factories were toxic nightmares. Sulfuric acid production released fumes that ate away at workers' lungs. Alkali works produced such noxious gases that vegetation died around the factories, and workers developed severe respiratory problems within months of starting employment. A Royal Commission on Labour, conducted between 1892 and 1894, investigated these working conditions. The commission included inspectors with medical, chemical, and other expertise. They looked at lead works, chemical and alkali works, match factories, which we've already discussed, potteries, and quarries. Their findings were damning. They documented illness after illness, death after death, workplace after workplace where basic safety measures were non-existent, and their recommendation that the government should expand the staff of factory inspectors and investigate further. They even admitted that improvements were unlikely without legislation, but legislation was slow in coming, because passing laws that would force factory owners to spend money on worker safety, that was seen as interference with free enterprise. The market should regulate itself, many politicians argued. If working conditions were too dangerous, workers would simply leave and find employment elsewhere. Except, of course, they couldn't. When every factory is dangerous and you need money to survive, you don't have the luxury of being selective. You take what's available and hope you're one of the lucky ones who lives long enough to see old age. In 1902, a physician named Thomas Oliver edited a massive book called Dangerous Trades, The Historical, Social and Legal Aspects of Industrial Occupations as Affecting Health. It was 498 pages of documented horror. Oliver was a professor of physiology and a medical expert on multiple government committees investigating workplace dangers. He'd seen it all. The lead poisoning, the lung diseases, the industrial injuries that left workers permanently disabled. The book included an essay by Adelaide Anderson, one of the first female factory inspectors, titled Historical Sketch of the Development of Legislation for Injurious and Dangerous Industries in England. Anderson documented how slowly, how grudgingly, how inadequately the government had responded to workplace dangers. Each piece of protective legislation came only after years of campaigning, mountains of evidence, and usually multiple deaths that were too public to ignore. And even when laws were passed, enforcement was minimal. There were never enough inspectors. Fines for violations were too small to deter wealthy factory owners, and workers who complained risked being fired and blacklisted, making it impossible to find new employment. Women bore the brunt of this because they were considered more expendable than men. The ideology of the time held that men were breadwinners, heads of households, whose health and safety was paramount. Women were supplemental earners, temporary workers who'd leave to get married anyway, so why invest in protecting them? This wasn't stated policy exactly, but it was the underlying assumption that shaped how industries operated and how regulations were written and enforced. There's a particularly revealing statement from one of the government inquiries. A factory owner, being questioned about the dangerous conditions in his establishment, said essentially this: improvements would require spending money, which would reduce profits, which would make his business less competitive. Therefore, he couldn't afford to protect his workers, and the inquiry accepted this logic. Profit trumped human life. That was just how things were. Can you imagine a starker illustration of how little women's lives were valued? They could be slowly poisoned, their lungs destroyed, their bodies broken, and the response from industry and government alike was, well, yes, unfortunate, but what can we do? We can't possibly expect businesses to spend money on safety measures. That would be unreasonable. Here's what keeps me up at night. Some of these women knew they were being poisoned. They could feel their health declining. They could see co-workers getting sick, leaving, sometimes dying, and they came to work anyway. Because what choice did they have? A slow death from lead poisoning or a fast death from starvation? At least with the factory job, their families ate while they were still alive. The dangerous trades did eventually become safer. Very eventually. Labour unions fought for protections. Reformers documented abuses. Some factory owners, a minority but they existed, voluntarily improved conditions because they recognised it was the right thing to do. Medical understanding advanced. Technology improved. Regulations were passed and actually enforced, but the change took decades. Generations of women worked in these industries before meaningful protections existed. And even today, in many parts of the world, people, often women, work in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. The names of the industries have changed. The specific hazards might be different, but the fundamental calculus remains the same: profit versus human life, convenience versus safety, and far too often, profit and convenience win. The women who worked in the dangerous trades weren't heroes. They weren't making a statement or fighting for a cause. They were just trying to survive, doing the only work available to them in a world that considered them disposable. But their suffering eventually forced change. Their damaged lungs, their lead-poisoned bodies, their premature deaths became evidence that couldn't be ignored forever. So when we benefit from labour laws today, workplace safety regulations, limits on working hours, requirements for protective equipment, compensation for workplace injuries, we're benefiting from lessons learned on the bodies of women like these, women whose names we'll never know, women who died so that future generations might work in safety. Now we've spent time in factories and mines, in marshes and workshops. We've seen women poisoned by chemicals, work to collapse, and used as living bait for parasites. But there's one more category of women's work we need to discuss, one that Victorian society simultaneously relied upon and utterly despised, one that was illegal yet ubiquitous, one that women turned to when every other option had failed. We need to talk about the women who sold the only thing they had left to sell, their bodies. We need to talk about prostitution in Victorian England, and why so many desperate women ended up there. There's a particular cruelty in how Victorian England treated women who sold sex. Not the cruelty of punishment, though there was plenty of that, but the cruelty of hypocrisy. Society created the conditions that pushed women into prostitution, then condemned them for it. It needed their services, then arrested them for providing those services. It was perfectly willing to use these women, but utterly unwilling to protect them. And here's what rarely gets mentioned in polite histories. For many women, prostitution wasn't a moral choice. It was an economic one. It was what you did when your factory wages weren't enough to pay rent. When your husband died and left you with 4 children to feed. When you got pregnant and your employer dismissed you and no one else would hire you. When every single door had closed except one. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Most prostitutes in Victorian England weren't full-time sex workers. They were part-time, temporary. They were factory girls who sold sex on weekends to supplement wages that couldn't cover food and rent. They were seamstresses who turned to prostitution during slow seasons when there wasn't enough needlework to survive on. They were domestic servants between positions, finding temporary income until they could secure another household placement. A study from the era put it this way. Prostitution was ordinarily a part-time temporary employment of young women that offered a supplement to the low pay of other women's work, a buffer against recurrent unemployment, and an escape from the close supervision of factory work or domestic service. Read that again. A buffer against unemployment, a supplement to low wages. These women weren't choosing prostitution over respectable work. They were combining prostitution with respectable work because respectable work alone couldn't keep them alive. The economics are stark. We talked earlier about seamstresses earning about a penny an hour by 1906. A woman working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, would earn maybe 6 shillings. She needed about 12 to 15 shillings a week for basic survival, rent, food, clothing, fuel. The mathematics don't work. She's short 6 to 9 shillings every single week. Where does that missing money come from? For some women, the answer was prostitution. Maybe 2 or 3 encounters a week at 2 shillings each. Suddenly the budget balances. Suddenly her children eat. Suddenly she can pay rent and avoid the workhouse. Is this a choice? Technically, yes. Meaningfully, not really. Now, here's where Victorian morality reveals its ugliest face. If a woman was raped, actually raped, violently assaulted against her will, Victorian society blamed her. Not the rapist. Her. The assault was seen as a scandal that ruined her reputation, not a crime committed against her. She was damaged goods, spoiled, no longer marriageable, no longer employable in respectable positions. And if she became pregnant from that rape, the child was illegitimate, which carried enormous social stigma. The woman couldn't work in most factories or as a domestic servant. Who would hire a woman with a bastard child? Her own family might disown her. She'd be essentially unemployable except in the lowest, most desperate occupations. So here's the bitter irony. Rape pushed women into prostitution. The very crime that ruined them forced them into the work that society most condemned. They became prostitutes because they'd been raped, and then they were judged as sinful and wicked for becoming prostitutes. The logic is circular, cruel, and absolutely intentional. It kept fallen women fallen. It ensured they could never climb back into respectability. Victorian society had approximately 2,500 prostitutes arrested every year on average. 2,500 women, mostly young, mostly poor, charged with soliciting or loitering or whatever vague offence the police could apply. And here's what's revealing. The men who paid for sex were almost never arrested. The transaction required two people, but only one was criminal. Only one was considered morally degraded. The customers? They were just men being men. Boys will be boys. No harm done. This double standard was enshrined in actual law. The Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 1866 and 1869 were supposedly about preventing sexually transmitted infections in military areas. But look at what they actually did. They allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and force her to undergo invasive medical examinations. If she was found to have a sexually transmitted infection, she could be locked in a lock hospital for months for treatment. Men could be infected, could spread disease to dozens of women, could visit prostitutes every night of the week, and they faced no examination, no arrest, no consequences. The laws were specifically designed to control and punish women while leaving their male clients completely free. The lock hospitals themselves were revealing institutions. The London Lock Hospital, established back in 1747, treated both men and women for sexually transmitted diseases. But there was also the Lock Asylum, which only treated women, and treatment is a generous word. Women in the Lock Asylum underwent medical procedures, yes, but they also received moral instruction. They were taught that their infection was divine punishment for their sinful behaviour. They were reformed, or at least attempts were made to reform them, into properly submissive, chaste women. The assumption behind all of this was clear. Women who engaged in sex work were morally diseased as well as physically diseased. They needed to be cured of both. Meanwhile, the men who infected them, who paid for their services, who created the demand that made prostitution profitable, those men were just living their natural masculine lives. Nothing to see here. No moral instruction needed. But let's talk about the actual dangers these women faced, because the hypocrisy is only part of the story. The violence is the other part. Prostitutes in Victorian England had essentially no legal protection. If a client attacked them, beat them, raped them, robbed them, who could they report it to? The police who routinely arrested them for soliciting? The legal system that considered them criminals? They were outside the law's protection. Everyone knew it, including the men who used their services. Some prostitutes worked in brothels, which offered at least some measure of safety. A madam who'd throw out violent clients. Other women who could intervene if things went bad. But most prostitutes worked independently, on the streets, in parks, in dark alleyways. They were alone with clients, vulnerable to any violence those clients chose to inflict. And there was plenty of violence. Women were beaten, robbed, raped in ways that went beyond the transaction they'd agreed to, murdered. The number of prostitutes killed in Victorian England is impossible to know because many disappearances simply weren't investigated. Who cares if a prostitute goes missing? She was probably trash anyway, the thinking went. Maybe she left town. Maybe she died of disease. Either way, not worth the police time to investigate. And then there were the sexually transmitted infections. This was before antibiotics, remember? Syphilis was common, devastating, and essentially untreatable in any meaningful way. It progressed through stages. Initial sores, a rash. Then years later, tertiary syphilis that could cause blindness, dementia, paralysis, and death. Gonorrhea was also widespread and could lead to chronic pain, infertility, and sometimes death from secondary infections. Male prostitutes, often called rent boys, faced similar dangers. They were even more vulnerable than female prostitutes because male homosexual activity was criminally illegal. A rent boy couldn't report violence or theft without admitting to criminal behavior himself. They existed in an even darker shadow than female prostitutes, with even less protection and even more risk. And here's a question worth asking. Why did Victorian society need prostitution? If it was so morally abhorrent, why didn't they just eliminate it? Well, some tried. There were moral reform societies, religious groups that attempted to rescue fallen women, campaigns to shut down brothels. But prostitution persisted because there was enormous demand. Men wanted to buy sex, lots of men from all social classes. Some historians estimate that in London during the mid-Victorian period, there might have been 80,000 prostitutes serving a population of about 2.5 million. 80,000. That's roughly 3% of the entire population, though the real number is probably inflated. But even if the true figure was half that, it's still 40,000 women selling sex in a single city. Why so many? Because men wanted to buy sex and women needed to sell it. Victorian morality placed enormous emphasis on female chastity before marriage. Respectable young women couldn't engage in premarital sex without ruining their reputations. So where did young men go for sexual experience? Prostitutes. Where did married men go when their wives were pregnant or ill, or simply unavailable? Prostitutes. Where did men seeking activities their wives wouldn't consent to go? Prostitutes. Prostitution existed because it filled a need created by Victorian sexual mores. Society demanded female chastity while simultaneously demanding male sexual outlet. The only way to reconcile those demands was prostitution, and then society punished the women who provided the service it required. There's a physician named William Acton who wrote extensively about Victorian sexuality. His work encapsulates how restrictive beliefs about morality restrained sexual agency and created gendered hierarchies. Acton essentially argued that respectable women had no sexual desire. They tolerated sex for reproduction, but derived no pleasure from it. Only degraded women, fallen women, actually enjoyed sex. This scientific opinion was taken seriously. It shaped medical practice, legal doctrine, and social attitudes. Do you see what this does? It creates a binary. Good women who have no sexuality and bad women who do. And if you're a woman with normal human sexual desires, where does that leave you? Either you deny your sexuality entirely to remain respectable, or you accept being labelled degraded and fallen. This ideology also meant that if a wife couldn't fulfill her husband's sexual needs, and how could she, if she supposedly had no sexual desire herself, then of course he'd seek satisfaction elsewhere, with prostitutes, who were condemned for providing exactly what this ideology made necessary. The whole system was designed to trap women. Work a respectable job, you'll earn starvation wages. Supplement those wages with prostitution. You're a criminal and a sinner. Get raped. Your fault, and now you're unemployable. Have a child outside marriage. Social death. Try to work in factories or shops. They'll fire you for moral turpitude if they discover your past. There was no way out. Once a woman fell, through poverty, through violence, through pregnancy, through any of a dozen circumstances mostly beyond her control, she stayed fallen. Victorian society made sure of it. In 1860, a Member of Parliament named John Walter made a striking statement in the House of Commons. He said that if members look to the revelations in the divorce court, they might well fear that if the secrets of all households were known, these brutal assaults upon women were by no means confined to the lower classes. Translation: rich men beat their wives too. Respectable men were violent too. The veneer of Victorian propriety covered abuse in wealthy homes just as much as in poor ones. But Victorian society was invested in denying this. They preferred to believe that violence, immorality, and degradation were exclusively problems of the lower classes, that respectable families were immune to such things, even though everyone knew it wasn't true. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not romanticizing prostitution. It was dangerous, degrading, and traumatic for most of the women who did it. I'm not arguing that selling sex was empowering or liberating. For the vast majority of Victorian prostitutes, it was survival work done out of desperation in a system that offered no better alternatives. But I am arguing that we need to understand why women did it. We need to understand the economic pressures, the lack of options, the ways that Victorian morality and Victorian capitalism combined to push women into this work and then punish them for it. We need to see them as human beings making impossible choices, not as symbols of moral decay. And we need to recognize that some of these dynamics persist. Women today still sell sex out of economic necessity, still face violence and exploitation, still operate in legal grey areas that make it impossible to seek protection from abuse, still carry stigma that makes it hard to leave sex work even when they want to. The details have changed. The fundamental economics haven't. Victorian prostitutes were women whose work was buried, hidden, denied. They appear in police records and Moral Reform Society reports, but rarely in their own words. We know their numbers, but not their names. We know their circumstances, but not their dreams. History tried to erase them as completely as it erased the mudlarks and the match girls and all the other inconvenient women who didn't fit the Victorian ideal. But they existed. They mattered. And their suffering reveals truths about Victorian society that no amount of elegant fashion and refined manners can cover up. While some women sold their bodies out of desperation, others were building businesses, managing money, creating independent economic lives for themselves in a society that legally prevented married women from even owning property. These were the secret businesswomen, the merchants, the shopkeepers, the entrepreneurs who found ways to thrive despite laws designed to keep them powerless. And their stories show us that even in the most restrictive times, women found paths to autonomy. Not all Victorian women were victims. Some were fighters. Some were entrepreneurs. Some looked at a system designed to keep them powerless and said, "Watch me anyway." These were the businesswomen, the merchants, the shopkeepers, the market traders who carved out economic independence in a world that legally prevented married women from owning property, who built businesses despite laws that gave their husbands control of any money they earned, who thrived in the cracks and margins of Victorian capitalism, creating small empires that history largely forgot to record. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Margaret, though that's not her real name because I don't know her real name. None of the official records bothered to preserve it. But her type existed throughout Victorian England, and her story represents thousands of others like her. Margaret runs a market stall in Leeds. It's 1875. She's a widow. Her husband died 3 years ago in a factory accident, leaving her with 3 children and exactly 0 financial security. No life insurance, no pension, no inheritance worth speaking of, just debts he'd accumulated and children who needed feeding. So Margaret did what she had to do. She took the few shillings she had left, bought fabric remnants from a textile mill, and set up a stall at the local market. She sold ribbons, trimmings, buttons, small sewing notions. The profit margins were razor thin, but she was smart. She noticed what sold, what didn't. She built relationships with suppliers who'd give her better prices. She learned to spot quality at a glance. And slowly, painfully, she built a sustainable business. 3 years later, she's expanded to 2 stalls. She employs another widow to run the second one. She's thinking about renting a small shop, though the legal complications worry her. Because here's the thing. As a widow, Margaret has rights. She can own property. She can enter into contracts. She can manage her own money. But if she remarries, which society constantly pressures her to do, all of that ends. Everything she's built becomes her new husband's property. Her business, her inventory, her bank account, all of it legally transfers to him the moment they wed. So Margaret stays unmarried. It's a calculated choice. Economic independence versus social respectability. And Margaret, practical woman that she is, chooses independence. This dynamic, widows and single women having more economic autonomy than married women, shaped Victorian business in fascinating ways. Look at the records from market stalls and small shops throughout England. An overwhelming number were run by widows or unmarried women. Not because these women were better at business, but because they were legally allowed to conduct business in their own names. Married women faced absurd restrictions. Under the doctrine of coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts without his permission, couldn't own property. Any wages she earned technically belonged to him. If she started a business, he owned it. If she inherited money, it became his. There's a striking example of this injustice. Elizabeth Gaskell. You might know her as Mrs. Gaskell, the famous Victorian novelist. She wrote North and South, Cranford, numerous other successful books. She was friends with Charles Dickens and Charles Kingsley. She was, by any measure, a successful professional writer who earned substantial money from her work, and every penny she earned legally belonged to her husband, William Gaskell, a Unitarian minister. Elizabeth had no legal right to her own income. Now, by all accounts, William was a decent man who allowed Elizabeth to manage her earnings. But the point is, he allowed it. It was his choice, his permission. If he'd been a different sort of man, he could have taken every shilling she earned and spent it however he pleased, and she'd have had no legal recourse. This absurdity wouldn't be fully corrected until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, which finally gave married women the right to own and control their own property and earnings. Think about that timeline. Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 33 years before married women gained the basic right to control their own money. And even then, social pressure and practical obstacles meant many married women still had their finances controlled by their husbands. But back to the businesswomen who found ways around these restrictions, because they were creative, resourceful, and determined. Fashion was a major opportunity. The Victorian era was obsessed with appearance, with fashion, with constantly changing styles, and someone had to provide all those goods. Many someones, actually. The fashion industry offered more job opportunities for women than almost any other field, even more than today in some ways. There were dressmakers, we've talked about those workers, but also shop owners who sold dresses. There were milliners who designed and sold hats, corset makers, glove sellers, haberdashers selling ribbons, laces, trimmings, women who sold fashion accessories at market stalls or from pushcarts on busy streets, travelling merchants who'd go to wealthy homes with samples and take custom orders. And here's what's interesting. The most successful of these businesswomen occupied a strange social position. They weren't quite working class. They were employers, business owners, property holders in some cases. But they weren't quite middle class either. They worked with their hands, they operated in public spaces, they engaged in trade. Trade was considered somewhat vulgar by the upper classes, beneath the dignity of a true lady. So these businesswomen existed in a liminal space, too successful to be dismissed as mere workers, too commercial to be fully respectable, and many of them seemed perfectly content with this arrangement. Respectability is lovely, but it doesn't pay the rent. Let me tell you about the costermongers, street sellers who sold fruits, vegetables, fish, and other goods from pushcarts. This was a massive industry in Victorian London. Estimates suggest there were about 30,000 costermongers working the streets in the mid-1800s, and a significant number were women, wives working alongside husbands, widows running their own operations, single women who'd inherited or built their own rounds. These women had encyclopedic knowledge of their inventory. They knew which suppliers offered the best quality at the best prices. They knew their regular customers, who wanted the ripest fruit, who preferred items slightly underripe, who had credit they were good for, who needed to be watched carefully. They knew the rhythm of the streets, the best corners, the competition, the police who might hassle them for blocking sidewalks. This was skilled work. It required capital. You needed money to buy inventory. It required knowledge of produce, of markets, of customers. It required physical strength. Those pushcarts were heavy. It required social skills, the ability to call out to customers, to banter, to build relationships. And it required courage. You were operating in public spaces where you faced harassment, competition, and constant uncertainty. But the rewards could be meaningful. A successful costermonger could earn enough to support a family, could save money, could eventually transition to a fixed market stall or even a shop. It was a path to economic security, however narrow and uncertain. There were also women who ran boarding houses and lodging houses. This was considered more respectable than street trading because it happened in a domestic space, but it was no less entrepreneurial. You needed to find property, furnish rooms, attract lodgers, manage the household, collect rent, handle disputes, and somehow make a profit after covering costs. Some boarding houses catered to specific clientele: theatrical performers, seasonal workers, students, single men. The landlady needed to understand her market, provide appropriate accommodations, and maintain her reputation. A well-run boarding house could be quite profitable. A poorly run one could bankrupt you and leave you homeless yourself. And then there were the really ambitious women, the ones who built substantial businesses, women who owned multiple properties, who employed dozens of workers, who operated on a scale that put them in direct competition with men. These women had to be twice as smart and work twice as hard, because every step of the way they faced obstacles men didn't. They couldn't easily get business loans. Banks preferred to lend to men. They couldn't join professional organizations or business associations. Most were male only. They had to find male proxies to sign certain contracts. They had to work around legal restrictions at every turn. And yet, they succeeded. Not in huge numbers. The obstacles were too great for most women to overcome. But enough succeeded to prove us possible. Enough succeeded to show that women could be just as capable, just as shrewd, just as effective at business as men, if only given the opportunity. There's a fascinating contradiction at the heart of Victorian attitudes toward businesswomen. On one hand, the ideology of separate spheres said women belonged in the domestic realm, not the public realm of commerce. Women were supposed to be angels in the house, focused on moral and spiritual matters, not sullying themselves with money and trade. On the other hand, Victorian capitalism desperately needed women's labour and entrepreneurship. The economy couldn't function without them, so society created this strange doublethink where women's work was simultaneously essential and invisible, acknowledged and denied, valued in practice and devalued in principle. Businesswomen navigated this contradiction carefully. Many of them downplayed their own success, presented themselves as merely helping their husbands or sons, emphasized that they were doing business out of unfortunate necessity rather than ambition. This allowed them to continue working while maintaining some claim to respectability. But make no mistake, many of these women were ambitious. They wanted success. They enjoyed the challenge of building something. They took pride in their accomplishments. They just couldn't say so too loudly, or they'd face social backlash. Now, I want to talk about a profession that was considered entirely respectable for women: teaching. By the late Victorian era, teaching had become one of the few middle-class occupations open to women who needed to earn money. If you were a gentlewoman who'd fallen on hard times, becoming a governess or school teacher was acceptable in a way that running a shop or selling goods would never be. But here's the reality: teaching was brutally underpaid. Male teachers earned significantly more than female teachers for identical work. Female teachers often lived in near poverty, barely scraping by on salaries that assumed they had family support to supplement their income. And yet, women flooded into teaching because the alternatives were so limited. If you were educated and middle class, what else could you do? You couldn't work in a factory. That was beneath your station. You couldn't become a shopkeeper, too commercial. You couldn't be a doctor or lawyer. Those professions were closed to women. So you taught, and you accepted starvation wages, and you hoped you didn't get sick or old or unable to work because there was no pension, no retirement, no safety net. The late Victorian period did see some changes. The Married Women's Property Acts that I mentioned earlier were huge. Women gained the right to attend universities, though many professions still wouldn't hire female graduates. Some women became doctors, breaking into a field that had been completely closed to them. Women began entering clerical work as typewriters and telephones created new job categories. But these changes came slowly and benefited primarily middle-class and upper-middle-class women. Working-class women, the vast majority, still face the same limited options: factory work, domestic service, street selling, or prostitution. The range of choices expanded for some women while remaining starkly limited for most. What strikes me about Victorian businesswomen is their resilience and creativity. They found paths where none officially existed. They built businesses despite laws designed to prevent them from doing so. They succeeded in a system rigged against them, and they did it all while maintaining the facade of domestic femininity that society demanded. These women were revolutionaries in their way, not loud revolutionaries with banners and speeches, quiet revolutionaries with market stalls and account books and determination. They proved that women could succeed in business, could manage money, could make economic decisions. They laid the groundwork for future generations of female entrepreneurs and professionals. But their work was hidden, buried, erased from official histories, just like the match girls and mudlarks, and all the other women whose labour built Victorian England. We don't know most of their names. We don't have their photographs. We don't have their stories in their own words. We just have glimpses in census records, business registries, occasional mentions in newspapers, and yet they were everywhere. In every market, on every commercial street, behind the counters of shops, managing boarding houses, running small businesses. They were the hidden infrastructure of Victorian commerce, and they deserve to be remembered. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. We've met women who were poisoned by their work, who stood in cold water collecting leeches, who sewed until they collapsed, who sold sex out of desperation, who built businesses against all odds. But there's one more category of women's work we need to explore. The bizarre occupations, the strange jobs, the professions so unusual, so odd, so utterly Victorian that when you hear about them, you'll wonder if I'm making this up. Professional mourners, cat meat deliverers, pure finders collecting dog excrement, and so many more strange occupations that prove Victorian ingenuity had no limits, even when that ingenuity was applied to the most unusual work imaginable. Victorian ingenuity knew no bounds. If something needed doing, someone would find a way to monetize it, and I mean anything, including jobs so strange, so specific, so utterly bizarre that when you hear about them, you'll be convinced I'm making them up. I promise you, I'm not. Let's start with one of my favorites, professional mourners, also called mutes. These were people, often women, hired to attend funerals and cry. Yes, really. Wealthy Victorians were obsessed with having impressive funerals. The more mourners, the more tears, the more visible grief, the better. It demonstrated how important the deceased was, how beloved, how worthy of public sorrow. But what if you didn't have enough genuine mourners? What if your social circle was small, or you'd outlived most of your friends, or you were just kind of an unpleasant person, and not many people wanted to come weep at your grave? Solution: hire professional mourners. These women would dress in full black mourning attire, veils, gloves, the whole costume. They'd walk in the funeral procession weeping dramatically. They'd dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They'd perhaps wail a bit if that was the style the family preferred, and they'd be paid a few shillings for their performance. Because that's what it was, a performance, theatre for the dead. The really skilled professional mourners could cry on demand. They developed techniques, thinking of sad things, pinching themselves, using irritants near their eyes, whatever worked to produce genuine-looking tears. Because you couldn't just pretend. The other funeral attendees would notice if your grief seemed fake. You had to sell it. And here's what's fascinating. This occupation hasn't completely died out. Professional mourners still exist in some cultures and contexts. In some places, they've even become more common in recent years as extended families have become more geographically scattered and traditional community structures have weakened. So those Victorian women were ahead of their time, in a morbid sort of way. Now, speaking of morbid, let me tell you about the resurrection men. Well, technically these were mostly men, but women were involved too, and the whole business was so bizarre it deserves mention. In the early Victorian period, medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy lessons, but the only legal source of bodies was executed criminals, and there weren't enough executions to meet demand. So what do you think happened? A black market in corpses developed. People, resurrection men, would go to cemeteries at night, dig up recently buried bodies, and sell them to medical schools. This became such a problem that families would hire guards to watch over fresh graves for the first few weeks after burial, until decomposition made the body worthless for anatomy. Some cemeteries installed mort safes, heavy iron cages placed over graves to prevent exhumation. The whole system was macabre and ridiculous, and entirely avoidable if the law had just allowed medical schools access to unclaimed bodies. But this was Victorian England, where logic often took a backseat to tradition. Women's role in this trade? Sometimes they were the ones who identified recently deceased people who had no family to protect their graves. Sometimes they helped transport the bodies. Sometimes they were the guards hired to prevent body snatching. Either way, it was grim work that paid reasonably well because not many people wanted to do it. But let's move on to something less gruesome and more strange. Let me introduce you to the Pure Finders. We've mentioned them briefly before, but they deserve more attention because this job is so wonderfully, horribly Victorian. Pure Finders collected dog excrement from the streets of London. Pure was the Victorian euphemism for dog feces, and it was actually a valuable commodity. Why? Because it was used in leather tanning. The enzymes in dog waste helped break down the leather and make it soft and supple. Tanneries would pay for fresh, high-quality pure, so Pure Finders, usually elderly women or children, would walk the streets with buckets and scrapers collecting dog waste. They knew the best locations, wealthy neighbourhoods where people walk their dogs, parks, specific street corners. They knew how to identify fresh pure versus old pure. They knew which tanneries paid the best prices. The work was exactly as unpleasant as you'd imagine. You smelled terrible. Your hands were constantly contaminated. You were handling waste all day. But it paid slightly better than some other desperate occupations, and it required no particular skill or equipment beyond a bucket and a willingness to do what most people wouldn't. And yes, before you ask, there were also people who collected human waste. Night soil men we mentioned earlier, but there were also women who worked in related capacities, cleaning privies, managing cesspits, dealing with the massive sanitation problems of Victorian cities before modern sewage systems were built. Speaking of animals, let me tell you about a job that sounds made up but absolutely existed. Cat meat deliverers. This was exactly what it sounds like. In Victorian England, particularly London, there were people who delivered meat specifically for cats. Wealthy households kept cats, and those cats needed feeding. Some entrepreneurs realized they could make money by collecting scraps of meat unsuitable for human consumption and delivering them to cat-owning households. It's almost adorable in its specificity, isn't it? Someone looked at Victorian England and thought, you know what this society needs? A cat meat delivery service. And apparently they were right, because the business existed for decades. Then there were the watercress sellers, usually young girls who'd wake before dawn to harvest watercress from streams and brooks, then spend the day walking the streets selling it from baskets. Fresh watercress, a penny a bunch. This was seasonal work, only possible in spring and summer when watercress grew abundantly. The girls would walk miles every day, their feet often bare, their voices hoarse from calling out to potential customers. Henry Mayhew interviewed several watercress girls for his study of London labour. One girl, age 8, told him she'd been selling watercress for 2 years. She started when she was 6. She'd wake at 4 in the morning, walk to the streams to collect the cress, then spend hours selling it. On a good day she might earn 6p. On a bad day, nothing. And this was considered normal, a legitimate way for a child to contribute to her family's income. Let me tell you about crossing sweepers. These were people, men, women and children, who'd stake out a specific street crossing and sweep it clean for pedestrians. Victorian streets were filthy. Horse manure, mud, garbage all mixing together. Ladies in their long skirts couldn't cross without getting their clothes hopelessly dirty. So crossing sweepers would keep their particular crossing clean and hope for tips from grateful pedestrians. This sounds simple, but there was actually competition for good locations. A crossing near wealthy homes or shops could be lucrative. A crossing in a poor neighbourhood might earn nothing. So there were territorial disputes, informal hierarchies, an entire underground economy around the question of who got to sweep which crossing. And then there were the jobs that required specialised skills. rat catchers for instance. Victorian cities were overrun with rats, and someone had to control the population. Rat catchers used dogs, usually small, quick terriers, trained to hunt rats. The dog would go into cellars, sewers, warehouses, anywhere rats congregated, and kill as many as possible. The rat catcher would be paid by the number of rats killed, so there was incentive to be very good at it. Some rat catchers were women. It required courage. Rats can be vicious when cornered, and it required a good relationship with your dog. But it paid decently, and there was always demand. Plus, there was a certain pride in being skilled at something most people found too disgusting or frightening to attempt. There were also jobs that existed purely to serve Victorian social rituals, like the women who made and sold mourning jewellery, brooches and rings that contained locks of hair from the deceased. After someone died, their hair would be carefully cut, preserved, and woven into jewellery designs. Family members would wear these pieces as remembrance. Someone had to create them, and it was often women working from home, carefully braiding and arranging human hair into decorative patterns. Can you imagine that as your daily work? Sitting at a table, handling dead people's hair, creating jewellery from it. It requires a particular kind of detachment, but the Victorians were obsessed with elaborate mourning rituals, so there was steady demand. And speaking of hair, there were hair workers who created hairpieces and wigs from human hair. They'd buy hair from women who were desperate enough to sell it, usually poor women who'd let their hair grow long specifically to sell it. The hair would be sorted by colour and quality, then woven into switches, braids and full wigs for wealthy women who wanted more elaborate hairstyles than their own hair could support. The women selling their hair got a few shillings. The women buying hairpieces paid pounds, and the hair workers in the middle made a living from the transaction. It's another example of Victorian capitalism creating markets for anything that could be bought or sold, including parts of the human body. There were also magicians' assistants, women who worked in theatrical magic acts. This required being slim and flexible enough to fit into boxes, cabinets, and other apparatus used in illusions. You needed to be comfortable being sawed in half, made to disappear, transformed into animals. Well, not actually, but you needed to make audiences believe these things were happening. This was considered slightly scandalous work because it involved wearing revealing costumes and appearing on stage, which was associated with loose morals. But it was also fascinating work that involved travel, creativity, and being part of something spectacular. Some women who started as magicians' assistants became performers in their own right, learning the tricks and eventually creating their own acts. And then there's my personal favourite bizarre occupation, the toshers. These were sewer hunters, people who ventured into London's underground sewage system looking for valuables that had been dropped or flushed. Money, jewellery, anything metal that might have washed into the sewers from streets or homes above. Toshers were mostly men, but some women worked as toshers or in related capacities. It was phenomenally dangerous. The sewers were dark, toxic, full of rats, prone to sudden flooding when heavy rains sent torrents of water rushing through the tunnels. Toshers could get lost in the maze of passages. They could be overcome by toxic gases. They could drown. But they could also find valuable items. A lost ring worth months of ordinary wages, coins by the handful. Occasionally something truly valuable would wash into the sewers, and the tosher who found it would have a windfall. It was gambling with your life for the chance of modest riches. And people did it because the certain poverty of conventional work seemed worse than the uncertain dangers of sewer hunting. There were also women who worked as rag sorters in rag factories. Before paper could be made from wood pulp, it was made from cloth rags. Rag sorters would go through piles of collected rags, often filthy, flea-infested, disease-carrying rags, and sort them by type and quality. The best rags went to make fine paper, the worst went to make rougher grades. This was considered one of the lowest-paying, most degrading jobs available. The rags were disgusting, the work was mindless, the pay was terrible, but it was work and it was better than starvation, so women did it. What strikes me about all these bizarre occupations is the creativity involved. Someone had to think of these jobs. Someone had to realize that dog waste could be sold, that professional mourners could be hired, that sewer hunting could be a viable occupation. Victorian poverty created brutal desperation, but it also created innovation. People found ways to survive no matter how strange or degrading the work. These jobs were mostly invisible to respectable society. The wealthy ladies wearing hair switches didn't think about who'd sold the hair or who'd woven it. The gentlemen with clean street crossings didn't think about the sweepers. The doctors using anatomical specimens didn't think about the resurrection men. Victorian society depended on these strange occupations while pretending they didn't exist. And that's the common thread running through all the women's work we've discussed tonight. Whether it was poisonous, exhausting, degrading, bizarre, or merely invisible, women's labour built Victorian England. Their hands made the matches, sewed the clothes, collected the leeches, sorted the rags, swept the crossings, mourned the dead. Their work was everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. But we've reached the end of our journey through Victorian women's secret occupations. We've travelled from match factories to the Thames mud, from writerly disguises to dressmaking workshops, from poisonous fashions to deadly industries, from desperate prostitution to ambitious business ventures, from leech collecting to professional mourning. We've met women whose names we'll never know, but whose courage and resilience deserve to be remembered. And now, in our final moments together, it's time to reflect on what all these stories mean, what they teach us about history, about women, about survival, about the systems that try to bury these stories and why we need to unearth them. So here we are. We've walked through the shadows of Victorian England together, and what have we found? Women, everywhere, working in ways that were deliberately hidden, systematically erased, carefully forgotten by the history books that preferred to remember queens and ladies, and drawing rooms instead. But they were there, in the match factories, breathing phosphorus until their jaws rotted away, in the Thames mud, searching for coal scraps at dawn, behind male pen names, writing novels that changed literature forever, at sewing machines, stitching for 20 hours straight, wearing poison for beauty, standing in marshes, offering their legs to leeches, working with lead and chemicals that destroyed their lungs, selling sex when every other door had closed, building businesses despite laws designed to stop them, weeping at strangers' funerals, collecting dog waste, sweeping street crossings, finding ways to survive in a world determined to make survival as difficult as possible. Let me ask you something. Why were these stories buried? Why did history try so hard to forget these women? Part of it is simple classism. History has always been written by and about the wealthy and powerful. Working-class lives, male or female, are rarely preserved in detail. We know more about what Queen Victoria ate for breakfast than we know about the daily lives of the thousands of women who worked in her palace. But there's more to it than class. There's gender. Victorian ideology demanded that women be angels in the house, pure and domestic and removed from the dirty world of work and money. The existence of millions of working women contradicted this ideology. It revealed that the separate spheres doctrine was a fantasy, a lie that only applied to women wealthy enough not to need employment. so their work was hidden. Census takers categorized working women as having no occupation. Factory records minimized female employment. Even the women themselves sometimes downplayed their work to maintain respectability. The entire society conspired to make working women invisible, and it worked. For over a century, historians largely accepted the Victorian myth. They believed that most women didn't work outside the home. They thought working women were rare exceptions. They assumed that the limited mentions of female employment in official records reflected reality rather than systematic erasure. It wasn't until modern historians went back to the original sources, actually reading census records carefully, interviewing descendants, examining business records, piecing together scattered evidence, that the truth emerged. Victorian England was full of working women. They were everywhere, doing everything. The invisibility was constructed, deliberate, a collective act of historical amnesia. Why does this matter? Why should we care about women who died over a century ago, whose names we don't even know? Because their struggles shaped the world we live in today. Every labour law protecting workers came from struggles like the Match Girls strike. Every regulation about workplace safety emerged from the deaths of women in dangerous trades. Every expansion of women's legal rights, the right to own property, to control their earnings, to enter professions, was built on the quiet resistance of women who refused to accept powerlessness. The Match Girls who struck in 1888 weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for every worker who came after. When they marched to Parliament, when they demanded to be treated as human beings rather than disposable machinery, they were creating precedents that labour organisers would use for generations. The women writers who hid behind male names weren't just protecting their own careers, they were proving that women could write serious literature, could handle complex ideas, could contribute to intellectual life. When Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot and George Sand succeeded, they made it slightly easier for the next generation of women writers, and then those women made it easier for the generation after that. Progress is cumulative. It builds on itself. The businesswomen who found ways around legal restrictions showed that women could manage money, could make economic decisions, could succeed in commerce. This evidence, scattered, anecdotal, often downplayed, eventually contributed to the Married Women's Property Acts and other legal reforms. You can't keep claiming women are incompetent with money when thousands of them are clearly running successful businesses. Even the most desperate occupations, prostitution, leech collecting, rag sorting, reveal important truths. They show us that survival takes many forms, that people will do whatever they must to keep living, that judgment from those who've never faced such choices is meaningless, and that the difference between respectable and degraded work is often just economics and circumstance, not morality. Now, let me connect this to the present, because these aren't just historical stories. These patterns persist. Think about the phrase women's work. What does it conjure? Underpaid labour, care work, service jobs, work that's essential but undervalued. Sound familiar? That's the Victorian legacy. We've made progress, enormous progress, but the fundamental devaluation of work coded as feminine continues. Think about the global fashion industry. We talked about dressmakers working 20-hour days in dangerous conditions. Today, garment workers in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, predominantly women, work in similar conditions. Different country, different century, same exploitation. The Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013 killed over 1,000 workers, mostly women, in conditions that would have been familiar to Victorian seamstresses. We've exported the problem, not solved it. Think about invisible labour. Just as Victorian census records failed to count women's work accurately, modern economic statistics still struggle to account for unpaid domestic labour, care work, emotional labour. The work women disproportionately do remains invisible in GDP calculations, in economic models, in policy discussions. Think about the gender pay gap. Victorian women earned less than men for identical work. In 2025, women still earn less than men for identical work in most countries. The gap has narrowed, yes, but it hasn't closed. And for women of colour, for disabled women, for transgender women, the gaps are even wider. Think about respectable work versus degraded work. We still judge sex workers while ignoring the economic conditions that drive people into sex work. We still create artificial hierarchies of labour, valuing some forms of work over others based largely on who does them and how much physical or emotional exposure they require. I'm not saying nothing has changed. Obviously, enormous amounts have changed. Women can vote, we can own property, we can enter any profession. We have legal protections against discrimination. We have workplace safety regulations, labour laws, minimum wages. These are real achievements, hard won through generations of struggle. But the foundational issues remain. Work coded as feminine is still undervalued. Women's labour is still made invisible in various ways. Economic desperation still pushes people into dangerous or degrading work. And the women bearing the brunt of these problems are still disproportionately poor women, women of colour, immigrant women, women without other options. The Victorian women we've met tonight would recognise much of the modern world. They'd see progress, certainly, but they'd also see familiar patterns, the same calculations between survival and dignity, the same exploitation justified by economic necessity, the same erasure of women's contributions. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honour these women whose names we don't know, whose graves we can't visit, whose stories were nearly lost forever? First, we remember. We tell their stories. We refuse to let them be erased again. Every time someone romanticizes the Victorian era without acknowledging its brutality, we push back. Every time someone claims women didn't work historically, we correct them. Every time history tries to forget, we remember. Second, we connect past to present. We recognize that the exploitation of Victorian women workers has modern equivalents. We see the through lines, and we use that understanding to fight current injustices with the knowledge that these battles are old, these patterns are persistent, and change requires sustained effort across generations. Third, we value women's work, all women's work, the visible and invisible, the paid and unpaid, the respected and degraded. We push for economic systems that don't force people to choose between dignity and survival. We advocate for labour protections, living wages, workplace safety. We support efforts to make care work visible and valued. Fourth, we tell more complete histories. We insist that the story of any era includes working-class people, women, people of colour, immigrants, disabled people, queer people, all the groups that traditional history has marginalised or erased. We demand that museums include these stories, that schools teach them, that popular culture represents them, and finally, we recognise our own privilege and use it wisely. If you're watching this video, you likely have advantages that Victorian working women couldn't imagine: access to education, legal rights, economic opportunities. We can honour their struggles by using our advantages to create the world they fought for but never got to see. The match girls struck for better conditions. We can support modern labour organising. The mudlarks worked in toxic conditions. We can advocate for environmental protections. The writers hid behind male names. We can amplify women's voices. The dressmakers sewed until they collapsed. We can consider who made our clothes and under what conditions. The leech collectors sacrificed their health. We can push for universal health care. The prostitutes had no protection. We can support policies that actually help sex workers rather than punishing them. Every form of suffering we've witnessed tonight has a modern equivalent and a possible remedy. The question is whether we'll act on that knowledge or merely find these stories interesting and then move on unchanged. I want to end with something hopeful, because despite all the darkness we've explored, there is genuine hope in these stories. These women survived. Against all odds, against systems designed to destroy them, against poverty and violence and erasure, they survived. They found ways to keep going. They supported each other. They raised children. They built businesses. They wrote novels. They organized strikes. They created beauty even in the midst of horror. Their resilience is staggering. Their courage is undeniable. And their legacy is all around us. The rights we have, the protections we enjoy, the options available to us, all of it was built on foundations laid by women whose names we'll never know. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember them. The match girls with their rotting jaws, the mudlarks with their frozen feet, the writers with their secret names, the dressmakers with their bloodshot eyes, the women wearing poison, the leech collectors standing in cold water, the factory workers breathing toxic air, the prostitutes with no protection, the businesswomen building empires against all odds, the professional mourners weeping for strangers, all of them. Remember that you are the future they were building, the world they never got to see but helped create, the beneficiary of their suffering and their strength. And if you found value in their stories, if you felt moved by their courage, if you've recognized the connections between their struggles and our present, then maybe, just maybe, you'll carry these stories forward. You'll tell someone else. You'll make different choices. You'll fight different battles. You'll be part of the continuing work of creating a more just world. Because that's how change happens, not through single dramatic moments, but through accumulated small actions across generations. The match girls striking, the writers publishing under false names, the businesswomen refusing to accept powerlessness, each act small in itself, each act part of a larger pattern, each act making the next act slightly more possible. We are part of that pattern too. We are the inheritors of their struggle and the architects of what comes next. The question is, what will we build? Thank you for spending these hours with me, walking through the shadows of Victorian England, meeting these remarkable women whose work history tried to bury. Thank you for listening to their stories with open hearts and minds. Thank you for caring about people you'll never meet, who lived in a world vastly different from ours yet somehow startlingly familiar. I hope you'll sleep well tonight, with these stories settling into your mind like gentle snowfall, and I hope that when you wake you'll carry something of these women with you, their resilience, their courage, their refusal to be erased. If these stories have touched you, please share this video with someone who might appreciate it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I read every single one, and I'd love to know which stories resonated with you most. Subscribe if you'd like to join me on more journeys through hidden histories, forgotten stories, voices that deserve to be heard. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and where we might go next. Every story we uncover, every voice we recover, every erasure we reverse, that's the work of building a more complete, more honest, more just understanding of who we are and who we can become. Sleep well, friends. Dream of resilient women and better futures. And when you wake, remember, you are part of the story too. Until next time, when we'll explore another forgotten corner of history together, another group of people whose stories deserve to be told, another chapter in the endless human struggle for dignity, justice, and recognition. The past is full of secrets waiting to be discovered, and we've only just begun. Good night.